There is a short, crude internet cartoon from 2006, barely a couple of minutes long, that a young animator made partly to needle a company that had sent him a cease and desist letter, and hidden inside that ugly little parody is the entire skeleton of a show that would run for well over a decade. A loud old scientist, a nervous boy, a garage, a machine that tears open the fabric of somewhere else. Almost nobody who loves Rick and Morty has watched the thing it grew out of, and that is exactly the kind of fact we are here for tonight. Not the famous moments, the hidden ones, the details buried in the corners of episodes, the small canon facts that change how the whole thing reads once you know them. We are going through all of it, so get comfortable, turn the lights down, and if you haven't subscribed to Papertown yet, it really does help us keep making these. Let me start with that crude little cartoon because the origin of Rick and Morty is stranger and smaller than the machine it turned into. Before there was an Adult Swim juggernaut, before Emmys and sauce riots and a sprawling mythology about the shape of the multiverse, there was a 2006 short called The Real Animated Adventures of Doc and Mharti, made by Justin Roiland for a place called Channel 101. That was a monthly short film festival that Dan Harmon ran, a kind of open competition where filmmakers screened their work in front of a crowd, and the audience voted on which shorts survived to make another episode. That is where Harmon and Roiland orbited into each other, and the thing Roiland brought was, to put it plainly, a filthy Back to the Future parody. Doc Smith was the proto-Rick, a slurring, unhinged genius. Mharti McDonald's was the proto-Morty, a put-upon kid dragged along for the ride. The premise was a joke you could not put on network television, built around Doc pestering Mharti to solve every problem in the crudest way imaginable. It was designed to be tasteless. The story that has followed the property around for years is that Roiland made it in part as a shot at Universal, the studio that owns Back to the Future, a way of taking the Doc and Marty dynamic and dragging it somewhere no lawyer could follow. What matters for tonight is how much of the finished series was already sitting there in embryo. The relationship, the loud grandfather, and the anxious grandson is the load-bearing pillar of everything that came after, and it was fully formed years before the pilot. When Adult Swim and Harmon were looking to build a series around Roiland, they reached back for that dynamic and swapped time travel for interdimensional travel, which is a small sounding change that turns out to be everything. Time travel gives you one timeline you keep meddling with. Interdimensional travel gives you infinite timelines, infinite versions of everyone, and a canvas with no edges. A decision got made at the very inception that most people never think about, which is that this would trade the neat closed loop of the DeLorean for something that could never be closed. And here's the part I find genuinely striking. The most ambitious idea in the whole run, the infinite multiverse that makes every later mystery possible, was not some grand plan. It came from needing a legal and creative escape hatch out of a Back to the Future parody. The most cosmic thing about Rick and Morty started as a workaround. The pilot proper landed on December 2nd, 2013 on Adult Swim, and if you go back and watch those first 11 episodes with everything you now know, the series is showing you its hand constantly and trusting you not to notice. That opening episode has Rick drunkenly threatening to reset all of humanity, has him weaponizing a teenager, has a throwaway line about there being infinite universes with infinite versions of the same people. It is all there in the first few minutes, and we simply accept it as manic cartoon energy. The runtime was the standard Adult Swim quarter-hour block, roughly 22 minutes an episode, which is a detail worth holding on to because Rick and Morty does something unusual with that tiny window. It routinely fits the plot of a feature film into 22 minutes and then spends its remaining seconds on a joke. The density is the point, and that density is why something this short generates a mythology this deep. There is no room to explain, so the lore gets buried in single frames and half-heard lines, and it rewards the kind of obsessive rewatching that a sleep video like this one is, in its own calm way, an excuse to do. One more foundational fact before we go deeper, because it reframes the entire creative engine. For the first 6 seasons, Justin Roiland voiced both of the title characters, both of them. Every conversation between Rick and Morty, every argument, every tender moment, and every scream was one man talking to himself in 2 different registers, often improvised on the spot. The famous burps, Rick's constant wet belching mid-sentence were real and largely unscripted. The story told in interviews is that Roiland could not burp on command, so he would drink something to help it along and swallow air, and the recording sessions would capture whatever came out, with the belches then edited into the dialogue. It sounds like a small gag. It is actually a stylistic signature that made Rick feel physically real, like a body that could not quite contain itself, and it came from a performer wrestling with his own throat in a booth. Hold on to the fact that one voice carried both leads for 6 years, because when we get to the production upheaval later, the sheer scale of what had to be solved when that one voice was gone will land harder. Now I want to take apart one of the facts most confidently repeated across the entire fandom, because most people have it slightly wrong, and the correct version is far more unsettling. Ask a casual fan where the Smith family lives, and they will tell you, without hesitation, Dimension C-137. It is the number stitched into the official merchandise. It is the answer everyone gives, and it is not quite true. C-137 is Rick's designation, not the family's. It is the label for the reality our particular Rick was born in, the one whose Diane and whose Beth were taken from him. But the Earth where Beth and Jerry and Summer and Morty go about their lives for most of the series is not that Earth. To understand why, you have to go back to the 6th episode of the first season, an episode called Rick Potion Number 9, which is, in its own understated way, the deeply important and most misunderstood 22 minutes anyone ever wrote for this show. The setup is almost sitcom simple. Morty wants a girl at school to like him, so he begs Rick for a love potion. Rick, who cannot be bothered to do anything the careful way, whips one up using material from a flu virus, and it works far too well, and then it mutates, and then it spreads, and by the end of the episode, the entire population of Earth has been transformed into writhing, fused, fleshy horrors that fans came to call Cronenbergs, after the director whose films specialize in exactly that kind of body horror. Rick tries to fix it and makes it worse. He turns everyone into something even more monstrous, and then he does the thing that should stop your blood cold. He checks the multiverse, finds a reality that is almost identical to this one, a reality where a version of himself and a version of Morty have just died in a freak accident in the garage at the exact moment needed. And he portals himself and Morty over to that world, drags the corpses of the dead, Rick and Morty out into the yard, and buries them. Then he walks into that dead family's house, sits down at their dinner table, and just keeps living. Sit with what that means for a second, because the episode refuses to slow down and let you. Our Morty, the Morty we follow, the anxious kid we spend a decade caring about, watches his grandfather bury his own dead body in a stranger's backyard, and then has to go inside and pretend to be that stranger's son. The Earth we watch for the rest of the series, the house, the school, the parents, is not Morty's original home. It is a replacement. The original Earth, the Cronenberg one, is left behind as a ruin, and the original Beth and Jerry and Summer, the ones who actually raised this Morty, are abandoned to a planet of monsters. This is why calling the family's home C-137 is not just a technicality. Their current world is its own place, a replacement dimension the wiki most often records as C-131. Though the series itself stays deliberately slippery about the label, and I would rather tell you the shape of the truth than lean too hard on a number the series never cleanly says out loud. The load-bearing fact, the one that actually matters, is that our Rick is C-137 and the family's home is not. They are refugees squatting in a dead family's life. What gets me about this is how casually it is dropped and how completely it changes everything that comes after. Every emotional beat between Morty and his parents from that point onward carries a hidden asterisk, because these are not exactly his parents. Every sweet family moment has a version of it where you remember that the real family is rotting on an abandoned Earth. The writers knew what they had done. There is a strong argument that this single episode is where Rick and Morty stopped being a wacky science cartoon and became something much colder, a story willing to establish, in its 6th outing, that its own protagonist will erase a child's entire life rather than clean up his mess, and that the child will simply have to absorb it. Nothing resets. There is no button that puts the old Earth back. They just move. The dimensional labels themselves are worth pausing on, because an entire cosmology got built out of them and then had fun refusing to fully explain it. The Ricks of the multiverse use a letter and number coordinate system to tell realities apart, strings like C-137 or J19 Zeta 7, which is the home of a gentle, bullied Rick we will meet later. It is a filing system for infinity, a bureaucratic way of tagging universes so that a society of geniuses can keep their paperwork straight. Fans have spent years trying to decode the pattern, arguing over what the letters mean, whether the C stands for something, whether the numbers encode a kind of distance. And here's the honest answer. Nobody making this show has ever told us what the C means. It is fan speculation, every bit of it. And a good sleep essay should be willing to say that plainly rather than dress a guess up as a fact. What the system does tell you, just by existing, is how the Ricks see reality. Not as sacred, not as singular, but as inventory. A universe is an address. And once a place is just an address, it becomes very easy to abandon one and move to the next, which is precisely what Rick does in that 6th episode, and precisely the worldview the rest of the series spends years turning over. If you want to understand Rick Sanchez, and I mean really understand the engine underneath all the drinking and the cruelty and the cosmic showing off, you have to understand what happened in his garage. And you have to be careful about a fact the writers spent years hiding and then finally, devastatingly, confirmed. The heart of it is a woman named Diane, Rick's wife, and a daughter, a young Beth, and a bomb. The version the series eventually settled on, laid out fully in Rick, Mharti, Jack, the 10th and final episode of the 5th season, runs like this. Long before any of the adventures we watch, Rick was an ordinary genius living an ordinary life with a wife he loved and a little girl. Another Rick from another reality arrived with an offer. This other Rick had cracked interdimensional portal travel, and he wanted our Rick to join him, to become the kind of Rick who steps outside his own universe and stops caring about any single one of them. Our Rick said no. He wanted his family. And so this other Rick, to make a point, sent a bomb through a portal into the garage, and it killed Diane, and it killed that young Beth in an instant. Here is where the writers played a long, cruel game with their own audience. For a while, the series flirted with the idea that this memory was fabricated, that Rick had invented the dead wife story, that it was a convenient tragedy he told to explain himself. In the 3rd season, there is a moment that suggests the whole thing might be a manufactured excuse. And then Rick, Mharti, Jack pulls the rug the other way and confirms that it was real all along. Diane was real. The bomb was real. The killer was real. What Rick did next is the true origin of everything. He reverse-engineered portal travel himself, the very technology he had refused, and he used it to hunt the specific Rick who murdered his family across an infinite multiverse. For what amounts to decades, every adventure, every reckless jaunt, every reason he needed a grandson at his side, sits on top of that hunt. The nihilism is not the cause. The grief is the cause. The nihilism is what he built on top of the grief so he could keep functioning while he searched. The killer has a name the fandom uses, Rick Prime, sometimes called Prime Rick, and he is the closest thing the series has to a true overarching villain. He is not a monster from outside. He is a Rick, the same man from a different starting point, a version who made the opposite choice and cut every attachment loose. And what makes him genuinely frightening is a device he eventually builds, called the Omega device. And I need you to understand exactly what it does, because this is one of the singularly important pieces of lore in the whole series, and it is the one that fans most often get wrong. The Omega device does not kill a person. It kills a person across all of infinity at once. Fire it at a target and it reaches through the entire multiverse and erases every single version of that person in every reality, simultaneously, forever. And Rick Prime used it on Diane, not the one Diane in the one garage. Every Diane, every version of Rick's wife in every universe that could ever have existed was deleted in one blast. I want to slow down on why this matters so much because it closes a door the early episodes left tantalizingly open, and a lot of well-meaning fans, and honestly a lot of lore videos, still walk through that closed door and get it wrong. The whole premise of an infinite multiverse seems to promise that grief can always be undone. If there are infinite realities, then somewhere out there is a universe where your wife never died, and a man with a portal gun could simply go there. For years, that was the unspoken tragedy of Rick. that he could visit a living Diane and chose not to or could not bear to. The Omega device detonates that idea completely. After what Rick Prime did, there is no universe with a living Diane. There is no variant to visit, no reality to escape into, no version of that woman anywhere in all of existence. The one thing an infinite multiverse should have guaranteed him, another chance somewhere, was the exact thing his enemy made sure he could never have. The only Diane Rick can ever encounter again is one he builds himself, an artificial intelligence, a simulation, a voice, which is precisely what turns up later. And that hollowness is the point. That, to me, is the cruelest single fact in the whole thing, and it is the one you should never let anyone tell you wrong. Rick cannot go to a world where Diane is alive. That world does not exist. It was murdered along with her. The resolution of that decades-long hunt arrives in the 7th season in an episode whose title the fandom renders as Unmortricken, the 5th of that year, and it is worth walking through carefully because it is both a triumph and a trap. Rick finally corners Rick Prime, and he does not do it alone, which is a whole story we will come back to. In the confrontation, Rick Prime tries to use the Omega device again, and there is a horrifying demonstration of its power on another character, a wipe across all realities right in front of them. But the device is shut down and taken out of play, and Rick Prime is subdued and restrained, and then comes something very deliberate. No gadget finishes him, no clever trick does it. Rick C-137 kills Rick Prime with his own hands, beating the restrained man to death. And Rick Prime spends his final moments laughing and mocking, refusing to give Rick the catharsis of a villain who is sorry. Rick gets his revenge, the thing he organized his entire life around, and the writing is honest enough to show you that it fixes nothing. Diane is still gone from every reality. The hunt that gave his life shape is over, and Rick is left standing there with the one purpose he ever truly had suddenly finished, and nothing underneath it. The revenge was never going to fill the hole. The hole was the shape of a person the Omega device made sure would never exist again. To hunt across infinity, though, Rick needed a strange thing to be true, and that strange thing is one of the especially fascinating pieces of world building the series ever committed to. Somewhere out in the space between universes, countless versions of Rick Sanchez built themselves a home. They call it the Citadel of Ricks, and it is exactly what it sounds like. A vast station populated by an effectively endless number of Ricks and an equally endless number of Mortys. A whole civilization made entirely of the same two people repeated over and over with tiny variations. Think about the sheer strangeness of that for a moment. A society where every citizen is a variant of one man, and every servant, student, and sidekick is a variant of one boy. The Citadel first steps on screen in the 10th episode of the first season, an episode called Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, and it immediately complicates everything you thought was going on, because up to that point you might have believed our Rick was special, singular, the smartest man in existence. The Citadel reveals that he is one of a crowd, and worse, that the crowd mostly cannot stand him. For a long time, the Citadel was governed by a body called the Council of Ricks, a small ruling clique who set the rules for all the others. And our Rick, C-137, has a special relationship with the whole institution, which is that he despises it and refuses to take part in it. The delicious irony revealed much later back in Rick Mirai Jack is that our Rick was there at the beginning. He was among the Ricks who helped bring the Citadel and its founding structures into being, and then he walked away from the thing he helped create, because the one thing every Rick shares is that no Rick wants to be governed, least of all by another Rick. In that first Citadel episode, the Council frames him for a crime, hunts him, tries to control him, and he slips the leash because a room full of your own smartest enemies is still a room full of people who think exactly like you, which means you can predict every move they make. There is a bleak comedy to the Citadel, the idea that if you gathered infinite copies of a self-proclaimed genius, they would not build a utopia. They would build a bureaucracy, a police force, a class system, and a lot of resentment. And that class system is where the Citadel goes from a fun concept to something genuinely pointed, because for all their talk of being the smartest beings in any reality, the Ricks built a society with a bottom to it, and the people at the bottom are the Mortys. Out in the Citadel, there's a district called Mortytown, a rundown slum full of Mortys who have no Rick, discarded and unassigned, living rough. There is a Morty Academy where young Mortys are trained and processed and prepared to be handed out to Ricks who need one. The whole arrangement treats Mortys as a resource, a supply, a disposable underclass whose entire purpose is to serve a Rick. And that reframes the central relationship in a way I find genuinely uncomfortable once you have seen it. When our Rick keeps our Morty close, he is not doing something unusual. He is participating in a civilization built on the principle that Mortys exist to be used by Ricks. The tenderness we sometimes see between them is the exception fighting against the system, not the system itself. This is Rick and Morty telling you outright what a Rick is supposed to think a Morty is for. Within that endless crowd of identical men, the writers found room for a few individual Ricks who stick in the memory. And they are worth naming because each one is a little argument about what a Rick could be if he broke the mold. There is Doofus Rick from a dimension labeled J19 Zeta 7, and he is the joke that turns into a lump in your throat. Doofus Rick is gentle, kind, a little slow by Rick standards, mocked and bullied by the other Ricks for the crime of being nice. He befriends Jerry, of all people, the family member every other Rick treats as beneath contempt, and the two of them share a sweetness that the other Ricks find pathetic. The point it makes is simple and sharp. In a society of the smartest beings alive, the one who is decent is the one they treat as garbage. Intelligence and cruelty got tangled together so completely in Rick culture that gentleness reads to them as stupidity. And then there is the one that has haunted me since I first saw it, Simple Rick. In the 7th episode of the 3rd season, in a story built around the Citadel, we learn about a product the place manufactures, a wafer cookie called Simple Ricks, and we learn how the flavor is made. Somewhere in a facility, there is a Rick strapped into a machine, and that machine holds him inside a single, perfect memory. A memory of a quiet, ordinary morning holding his baby daughter, feeling completely content. That contentment, that pure, simple happiness is harvested, extracted, and used to flavor a cookie sold across the Citadel. A Rick's one moment of genuine peace, the memory of holding baby Beth, turned into a consumer product and drained out of him on a loop for profit. It is played partly as a joke, and it is one of the darkest things anyone has ever animated for this series, because it is the Citadel's whole philosophy in one image. Even happiness, even love, even the memory of a daughter is just another resource to a Rick, something to be extracted and monetized and consumed. The Ricks did not just build a police state out of copies of one man. They built a factory that eats his soul and sells it back to him as a snack. If the Citadel is the world, then the person who understood that world best and hated it most clearly was never a Rick at all. He was a Morty, and the story of Evil Morty is, I think, a remarkably carefully constructed long game. One of the sharpest things the writers ever attempted, a plan seeded in the very first season that did not pay off until the 5th. And once you see the whole shape of it, you realize the show was ahead of you the entire time. He first appears in that same 10th episode of the first season, Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, and on first watch you do not even register him as important. The episode has a villain, an especially cruel Rick the fandom calls Evil Rick, who kidnaps and tortures Mortys. And that Evil Rick has a Morty of his own, a quiet Morty wearing an eye patch, standing in the background, seemingly just another servant. It is only at the very end that everything turns over. The eye patch is a transmitter. The quiet Morty in the corner was never the servant. He was controlling Evil Rick the whole time, using him as a puppet, running the entire operation from behind a face nobody bothered to look at. When his cover is blown, he calmly destroys the transmitter and walks away into the crowd, uncaught, unnamed, and free. The fandom called him Evil Morty, and for years that was all anyone knew. What I love about that reveal is how completely it uses the class system against the audience. We had just been taught in that very episode that Mortys are furniture, that they are the disposable underclass, that no one watches them. And then the mastermind role goes to exactly the person everyone in the room and everyone in the audience had been trained to ignore. Evil Morty's greatest weapon is that a Morty is beneath suspicion. In a civilization built by geniuses who think all Mortys are interchangeable and stupid, being a Morty is the perfect disguise. He weaponized the contempt the whole system was built on. That is not evil in the cackling cartoon sense. That is a mind sharp enough to notice the one blind spot shared by every intelligent being around him, and patient enough to live inside it. His return, when it finally comes, is one of the great set pieces, and it happens in that same 7th episode of the 3rd season, the Citadel-focused outing where we met Simple Rick, a story that functions almost as a self-contained short film about Citadel society. By this point, the Citadel has been through upheaval and is rebuilding itself, and it is holding an election for president. Among the candidates is an unremarkable, idealistic Morty who runs on hope, a promise to fix the broken system, to give Morty's dignity. The other candidates dismiss him. The establishment dismisses him. And he wins, this underdog Morty, riding a wave of genuine belief from the Citadel's downtrodden. And then, once the votes are counted and the power is his, the mask comes off. The idealistic candidate is Evil Morty, and his first act as the newly elected president is to have the Citadel's Shadow Council, the hidden Ricks who truly ran things behind the scenes, systematically executed. The hopeful campaign was theater. He told an entire population exactly what they wanted to hear. Let their hope carry him to the one seat of real power in the Rick universe, and then use that power to start dismantling the whole apparatus of Rick control from the inside. Here's the thing that separates Evil Morty from every other antagonist, and the reason I hesitate to even call him a villain. He is not trying to conquer anything. He is not trying to rule for the sake of ruling. Everything he does, the mind control, the election, the executions, the long, silent years of planning, is aimed at a single goal, and it is a goal you can actually sympathize with once you understand it. He wants out. He wants to escape a reality that was rigged before he was ever born to revolve entirely around Ricks. Every Morty in his world exists as an accessory to a Rick. Every universe he could reach was hand-selected to keep Ricks on top. He looked at the shape of his own cage, understood it more completely than the men who built it, and decided he would rather burn the lock than live comfortably inside the bars. And to understand what that cage actually is, we have to talk about the single biggest idea in the whole mythology. The thing that explains why the multiverse Rick moves through is not the infinite multiverse it pretends to be. We have to talk about the Central Finite Curve. This is the kind of idea that reorganizes everything the moment you grasp it. And the writers waited until Rick Murray Jack, the 5th season finale, to fully lay it out, which means for years, fans were watching a series whose fundamental premise they did not yet know. Here's the concept as cleanly as I can put it. The multiverse is infinite, endless realities with endless versions of everyone. But the Ricks did not want to live in a truly infinite multiverse, because in a truly infinite multiverse, there would be countless universes where some other being, not Rick, is the smartest thing alive. And a Rick cannot abide that. So the founders of Rick Society, our own Rick among them, did something almost unthinkable. They walled off a section of the infinite. They drew a barrier, a curated boundary that encloses only those universes where Rick Sanchez is the smartest being in existence. Everything inside that boundary is Rick's playground, a subset of reality guaranteed to have him on top. Everything outside it, the vast overwhelming majority of the true infinite, is sealed away. That enclosed, curated slice is the Central Finite Curve. Let that settle, because it quietly rewrites everything. All those adventures across the multiverse, all those infinite possibilities dangled in front of you, were never actually infinite. Rick was always moving inside a fence he helped build. The green portals, the ones we watch him tear open episode after episode, only reach places inside the curve. He can visit any universe he likes as long as it is a universe where he is the smartest man in it. He literally cannot portal to a reality where he is not the top mind, because he deliberately cut himself off from all of them. And I think that is one of the sharpest choices any character in fiction has made about himself. Faced with an infinite multiverse, an actual infinity of possibility, Rick's response was to shrink it down to only the parts where he wins. He could not tolerate the existence of a smarter being anywhere, even in a universe he would never visit. So he built a cage around his own supremacy and called it freedom. The smartest man in the universe made his universe smaller so he could stay the smartest man in it. That is the cage Evil Morty was born into, and now his whole plan snaps into focus. When he overcharges the Citadel's dimensional machinery in the 5th season finale and punches a hole clean through the Central Finite Curve, he is not committing an act of villainy. He is doing the one thing no Rick would ever do. He is choosing the real, infinite over guaranteed supremacy. He steps through the breach into the true, uncurated multiverse, the endless reality that no Rick was ever willing to enter because out there, somewhere, something is smarter than a Rick. And that possibility is the one thing a Rick cannot stand. Evil Morty walks into it on purpose. He would rather be small in a real infinity than powerful in a rigged one. And the last we see of him, at least for a long stretch, is a Morty walking away into a freedom the entire Rick civilization sacrificed the multiverse to avoid. He was set up as the villain and then, almost gently, revealed as the only character brave enough to want the truth. That inversion, the real monster being the man who shrank existence to protect his ego and the real hero being the boy who wanted out, is the sharpest thing Rick and Morty has ever said about its own lead. There is a small technical point folded into all of this that trips people up, and it is worth stating plainly because it matters for how the world works. The barrier is why you cannot simply solve any problem by saying there is a universe where things are better, so go there. Inside the curve, the range of possible universes is limited by that one condition, Rick on top. Outside it, past the breach Evil Morty made, is the true unlimited reality, but ordinary portal travel could never reach it, which is the entire reason his escape was such an event. It required tearing the boundary itself, not just opening another green door. So when you hear someone confidently claim Rick could just pop over to a universe where anything at all is true, remember the fence. For most of the run, he was living inside a deliberately limited slice of infinity. And the limits of that slice, the fact that it only ever contained universes rigged in his favor, are a big part of why the cosmic freedom always had a quiet sadness underneath it. All that power, and he spent it pacing the inside of a cage he designed, so that raises the question the whole series is secretly built around, the one it keeps circling and never quite lets you settle. Why does Rick keep Morty around at all? On the surface, it looks like family, a grandfather taking his grandson on adventures. But we have already seen that Rick's society treats Mortis as tools, and we have seen that Rick is capable of burying a Morty's whole life without blinking. So sentiment alone is not a satisfying answer, and the writing knows it. In that same load-bearing 10th episode of the first season, the one that keeps turning out to hold the biggest secrets, you get a much colder explanation, delivered so quickly you might miss it. A Rick's brain, being the smartest thing in any given reality, gives off a kind of signature, a distinctive pattern that can be detected and tracked. If your enemies can read that signature, they can find you anywhere. But a Morty's brain produces a complementary pattern, and when a Morty is kept close to a Rick, those Morty waves wrap around the Rick's genius and cloak it, scrambling the signal, hiding a dangerous mind inside a haze of ordinary adolescent brain activity. Read plainly, that is a devastating thing to learn about the central relationship. It means that on some level, Morty is camouflage. He is not just a sidekick, and he is not just a grandson, he is a cloaking device with a heartbeat. A living blanket Rick throws over his own dangerous brilliance so the countless people who want him dead cannot lock on. The reason a Rick so often has a Morty, the reason the Citadel pairs them off like equipment, is not affection. It is function. A Rick without a Morty is a lighthouse in the dark, visible to every enemy. A Rick with a Morty disappears into the noise. And that is the argument the writers subtly make about the whole grandfather-grandson bond we have been trained to find sweet. Underneath it, there is a use. Morty's presence keeps Rick alive, not by loving him, but by hiding him. Now, I want to be fair because the series is smarter than a single cynical reading. It does not let Morty be only a tool, and it does not let Rick be only a user. Over the seasons, the relationship strains against its own cold origin. There are moments, real ones, where Rick clearly cares, where he sacrifices for Morty, where the mask of pure utility cracks and something like love leaks through. You are meant to hold both things at once, the biological camouflage explanation and the genuine, complicated bond, and to feel the tension between them. That tension is the engine of the entire series. Every warm moment carries the shadow of the cold fact underneath it, and every cold moment is haunted by the possibility that Rick means more than he admits. What makes it ache is that even Rick does not seem sure which one is true. He hides behind the useful explanation because the useful explanation does not require him to feel anything, and feeling things is the one activity a man who lost every version of his wife has spent decades trying to avoid. And here's what stays with me about the camouflage idea when you sit with it long enough. It is not really an argument against love. It is a description of how a broken man lets himself have love without admitting to it. Rick needs Morty close for safety, sure, but needing someone for safety and needing someone because you cannot bear to be alone with yourself are not as different as Rick would like them to be. He built a rationalization sturdy enough to explain why the boy is always there, a rationalization about brainwaves and enemies and tactics, and that rationalization conveniently lets him keep the one person he actually cannot function without, while never once having to say out loud that he cannot function without him. The Morty waves are real in the story's science. They are also, read another way, the most elaborate excuse a lonely man ever invented to keep his grandson at his side. That is the kind of double meaning this series is softly full of, a piece of hard science fiction hardware that turns out, on a second look, to be a portrait of a man who cannot say what he feels. If you want proof that Rick can love, though, you have to look away from his family and toward the one friendship the series treats as sacred, and it belongs to a man who is not a man at all but a bird. Bird Person is Rick's oldest and closest friend, a stoic warrior from a place called Bird World, and their bond goes back to a shared history of rebellion and war that we only ever see in fragments. Bird Person is the person who knows the real Rick, the one underneath the drinking and the deflection, and that is exactly why he is used to translate Rick's most famous line. You have heard it 1,000 times, wubba luba dub dub, and it is easy to take it for a nonsense catchphrase, a bumper sticker, a thing to shout at conventions. But back in the 11th episode of the first season, an episode called Ricksy Business, Bird Person stops and tells Morty what it actually means in Rick's old language. It means, I am in great pain. Please help me. Rick's goofiest catchphrase is a cry for help hidden in plain sight, and the only person who ever bothers to translate it is the one friend who understands him well enough to hear the pain under the noise. That reframing is the whole show in a single line. Rick has been broadcasting his suffering the entire time, out loud, constantly, in the form of a joke, and everyone, including the audience, learned to laugh at it and repeat it back to him without ever hearing what it said. Bird Person heard it, which is what makes what happens to him so hard. In the finale of the second season, an episode called The Wedding Squanchers, Bird Person gets married. His bride is a young woman named Tammy, a seemingly ordinary human who had been dating him. The wedding gathers Rick's whole scattered found family, and it should be the warmest moment we have been given. And then Tammy stands up and reveals that she was never real, that she is a deep cover agent for the Galactic Federation, that the entire relationship was an operation to lure Rick's associates into one room. She pulls out a weapon and shoots Bird Person dead at his own wedding in front of everyone, mid-celebration. It is one of the cruelest rug pulls ever staged here, a marriage that was a trap and a friend murdered by the woman he loved. Bird Person's story does not end with that death, though, and the twists it takes afterward are a good example of how this series refuses to let anything stay simple. The Galactic Federation recovers his body and rebuilds him, turning the dead warrior into a cybernetic weapon, a grim, mechanical version of himself the fandom came to call Phoenix Person, a corpse reanimated as hardware and pointed at Rick. For a stretch, Rick's best friend exists only as this hollow machine wearing his face. But he gets one more turn, and it is moving. In the 8th episode of the 5th season, a loving parody of Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, Rick goes inside Bird Person's own mind to try to save him, to give him a reason to want to live again. And the thing that finally reignites his will, the fact that pulls him back from the edge, is the revelation that he has a daughter. Bird Person is restored, brought back to genuine life, no longer a corpse and no longer a machine. And that is where his status sits, alive, not dead, not a cyborg anymore, but a living person again, with a child out in the universe. That child is worth a careful word, because the fandom sometimes gives her a name Rick and Morty never confirmed. Bird Person's daughter, his child with Tammy, is referred to in its own material simply as Bird Daughter, and while fans have floated other names, the honest thing to say is that the series has not canonized any of them. So Bird Daughter is what we should call her. She had been held prisoner by the Galactic Federation, and part of Bird Person's return to life involves reaching for her, freeing her, becoming a father in fact, rather than just in theory. As for Tammy, the woman who started all of it, she does not get let off. Rick catches up with her, and in the finale of the 4th season, an episode the fandom renders as Star Mort Rickturn of the Jerry. He shoots her in the head and ends her. She is dead. She is not lurking as some ongoing mastermind in later seasons. The agent who murdered Rick's best friend at a wedding got exactly 1 bullet in return, and that account is closed. What lingers is not the revenge, but the shape of it, the way Rick's whole life keeps following the same terrible pattern. The people he loves turned into weapons and taken from him, and Rick left to answer with violence that never quite balances the ledger. Since we have pulled the thread of what that catchphrase really means, we should follow it to the darkest single scene the series has ever aired, because Rick and Morty has a reputation as a wild sci-fi comedy, and people who have not watched closely tend to forget how far into genuine despair it is willing to go. It happens in the 3rd episode of the 2nd season, an episode called Autoerotic Assimilation, and it involves an old flame of Rick's named Unity. Unity is not a person in the way you are a person. Unity is a hive mind, a single consciousness that controls entire populations at once, spreading through a species and assimilating every individual into one collective will. Unity and Rick have a history, and when they reconnect, the episode lets us see a version of Rick that is, for once, almost happy. They are a perfect match precisely because they are so alike, 2 beings who reshape everything around them to their own design, 2 forces used to bending reality and people to their will. For a little while, Rick has someone who operates on his level, and you can feel him relax into it, and then Unity leaves him. It writes Rick a breakup note, and the reason it gives is the reason that cuts deepest, that being with Rick makes Unity worse, that Rick is a bad influence even on a creature that controls whole planets, that in order to be the best version of itself, Unity has to get away from him. The most togetherness-minded entity imaginable, a being literally made of connection, chooses isolation over being with Rick. And the episode follows him home from that rejection into the garage, and what happens next is filmed with almost no jokes at all. Rick, alone, methodically builds a device, a kind of helmet attached to a machine, and he sits down and puts it on and activates it, and it is a suicide machine. He is trying to kill himself. The device charges up to fire a beam into his own head, and at the last moment his body simply gives out, and he slumps unconscious, drunk, and slides out of the path of the beam, so that the machine fires into an empty wall and he survives by accident rather than by choice. The whole sequence is scored to a soft song, and it plays out in near silence, and it is the least funny thing this cartoon has ever done. It is a story dropping every layer of irony and armor and just showing you a man who wants to die. What makes that scene land so hard is everything you had already been trained not to take seriously. By that point, you have laughed at Wubba Lubba Dub Dub, you have enjoyed Rick's swagger, you have treated his drinking as a character quirk. And then all of it gets cashed in at once, and you see the floor of the pit those things were papering over. The catchphrase meant, "I am in great pain, please help me." The drinking was self-medication. The nihilism, the endless insistence that nothing matters, was never a philosophy he arrived at through cold logic. It is a painkiller. If nothing matters, then the wife he lost across all of infinity does not matter, and the daughter he half abandoned does not matter, and his own life does not matter enough to be worth the agony of living it. Rick preaches meaninglessness not because he believes the universe is empty, but because he needs it to be, because a universe with meaning in it is a universe where his losses are unbearable. I think this is the part of the series people underrate the most, and it is the reason I keep coming back to it. Rick and Morty could very easily have been a shallow thing, a smart guy being clever and gross for 22 minutes. What makes it last is that underneath the cleverest man in any universe, there is a genuinely, clinically depressed one, and the writing has the nerve to actually go there, to build an entire episode around a suicide attempt and then not undo it with a joke. Unity survives out there somewhere, a hive mind that decided Rick was too toxic to be near. And Rick goes on, and he has never pretended to be cured. The wound stays open for the rest of the run. Every reckless adventure after this is a man doing anything, absolutely anything, to avoid being alone in a quiet room with his own mind. Because the one time we watched him sit alone in a quiet room, he tried to end it. That is the engine humming under all the color and the portals. Not curiosity, avoidance. Let me turn to something lighter, or at least something that starts lighter, because this show has a genius for hiding its heaviest ideas inside its silliest inventions. And there's no better example than a small blue creature and a box. In the 5th episode of the very first season, an episode called Meeseeks and Destroy, Rick introduces the family to a device he calls the Meeseeks box. Press the button on top and a Meeseeks appears, a lanky blue humanoid with a permanent grin and a helium voice, and it exists to do exactly one thing. You tell it what you want, it helps you accomplish that single task, and the instant the task is complete, it vanishes from existence with a little pop. That is its entire life. Summoned to serve one purpose, and then gone. The family uses them for small stuff. Summer wants to be more popular, Beth wants to be a more complete woman, and the Meeseeks knock those out and disappear, satisfied. The catch, and the reason this cartoon gag turns into something like philosophy, is Jerry. Jerry, ever the weak link, asks his Meeseeks to help him take 2 strokes off his golf game, and Jerry is so hopeless that the Meeseeks cannot finish the job. And here you meet the horror sitting underneath the cheerful blue exterior. A Meeseeks that cannot complete its task does not simply give up and fade away. It cannot fade away because fading away is the reward it only gets for finishing. So it lingers, and lingering is agony because, as one of them explains, existence is pain to a Meeseeks. They are not built to persist. Every extra second alive is torture, and a Meeseeks in torture summons another Meeseeks to help it finish the task, and that one fails too and summons another, and soon there is a whole population of increasingly desperate, increasingly unhinged blue creatures, all trapped in a life they were never meant to have, and they turn violent, ready to kill Jerry if that is what it takes to finally be allowed to stop existing. Stay with the actual idea there for a second, because it is bleaker than almost anything the human characters say out loud. The Meeseeks are creatures for whom existence itself is suffering, and the only mercy available to them is to complete their purpose and be permitted to die. Life, to a Meeseeks, is a problem to be solved so that it can end, and the cruelest fate imaginable in their world is not death, it is being unable to die, being stuck alive with no way to finish the one thing that would release you. That is a startlingly dark statement to build a comedy set piece around. The notion that for some beings the kindest thing the universe can offer is non-existence, and that being denied it is the real torment. The Meeseeks want the pop. The pop is peace. Jerry's incompetence is, from a Meeseeks point of view, a sentence of eternal agony. And I do not think it is an accident that this particular lesson goes to Jerry, of all people, because Jerry is the family's designated failure, the man who cannot accomplish things, and here his inability to complete a simple task creates a small apocalypse of suffering. There is a quiet cruelty in the framing, the idea that Jerry is so fundamentally incapable that he breaks a system designed to be foolproof. But the Meeseeks themselves are the part that stays with me. They are a whole species reduced to pure purpose, beings with no life outside their function, and they let the writers ask a question they never quite answer about all the characters. What is a life that exists only to complete a task, and is it better to have a purpose you can finish and die, like a Meeseeks, or to be like Rick, a man who finally finished his life's one purpose when he killed Rick Prime, and then had to keep on living with nothing left to do? The Meeseeks get the ending they crave. Rick does not. And that contrast, the creature that gets to stop and the man who has to go on, is one of the saddest quiet jokes in the whole thing. There is one family member the writers play a very particular trick with, and understanding the trick means understanding one of the cleverest single mechanics they ever built. His name is Mr. Poopy Butthole, and if you have only half watched, you might assume he is a joke character, a silly recurring cameo with a silly name who pops up to say his catchphrase. What most people do not realize is that his entire existence is a genuine narrative puzzle, and the episode that introduces him, the 4th episode of the 2nd season, an episode called Total Recall, is as tightly constructed as anything the series has produced. The premise is a paranoid horror comedy. Alien parasites have infested the Smith house, and these parasites have a specific power. They cannot be seen for what they are because they implant false memories in everyone around them. Memories that make each parasite feel like a beloved old friend or relative who has always been there. Suddenly, the house is full of wacky characters everyone remembers fondly, and none of them are real, and the family has no way to tell who is a genuine person and who is a parasite wearing a lifetime of fabricated history. The way the family finally cracks it is the part that elevates the whole thing, because it is a real rule, cleanly stated and then used to solve the puzzle fairly. The parasites can only implant pleasant memories. Every false memory they create is a happy one, a fun adventure, a warm moment, a good time. They cannot manufacture a bad memory because their whole survival strategy is to be loved and trusted. So the family works out the test. Anyone you only have good memories of might be a parasite, but anyone you have a bad memory of, an argument, a betrayal, a moment they hurt you or annoyed you or let you down, has to be real because the parasites are incapable of planting anything unpleasant. Bad memories become the proof of reality. The people who have wronged you are the ones you can trust are actually there. It is a beautiful, cruel little inversion. The idea that love is not what confirms someone is real to you, conflict is. And that is exactly how Mr. Poopy Butthole survives the purge. As the family starts shooting the characters they only have sunny memories of, they turn on him too, and Beth shoots him, and everyone braces for him to dissolve into parasite goo like the others. But he does not. He bleeds. He is hurt. Badly because he is a real, flesh and blood being who has been part of their lives. And Beth just shot a real friend. The reveal lands because somewhere in there Beth realizes she has a negative memory of him, a real one, which under the episode's own airtight rule means he could never have been a parasite. He was the one strange character in the house who was actually there the whole time. And it is allowed to land with real weight, the family having gunned down a beloved friend on a false assumption, and Mr. Poopy Butthole limping away wounded, injured enough that it affects him afterward, carrying the physical cost of their mistake. I love this one because it is the writing being fair with the audience while still fooling almost everyone. All the information you need to solve it is right there. The rule is stated plainly, and yet the sheer number of fun fake characters overwhelms your ability to track who is real, which is exactly the state the family is in. And it leaves behind a permanent piece of canon that people still argue about, which is that Mr. Poopy Butthole, the character with the most disposable joke name in the whole show, is 100% real, a true and lasting member of the Smiths' extended world, not an illusion, not a bit, not a parasite. He goes on to appear again and again, often turning to the audience after an episode ends to check in, and his survival is a small monument to the episode's cleverest idea. In a house full of people who felt like family and were lies, the one who felt like a lie was family. The show hid its most real character behind its most fake-sounding name and dared you to shoot him. Now I want to spend some time on the machines because Rick and Morty hides some of its sharpest moral ideas inside its gadgets. And there is one invention in particular that is, all on its own, one of the more disturbing things in the whole series once you follow it all the way down. It appears in the 6th episode of the 2nd season, an episode called The Ricks Must Be Crazy, and it starts with a simple problem. Rick's spaceship battery has died, so Rick takes Morty inside the battery to fix it, and what is inside the battery is not wires or acid, it is a universe, an entire tiny universe that Rick created, with real planets and real intelligent life, and Rick powers his car by harvesting the energy those beings generate. The people of this microverse, as it is called, have been given a device by their god, a machine they are told to operate for the good of their world. And operating it, stomping on what the series calls Google boxes, generates electricity that flows up and out to charge Rick's car. They think they are running their civilization. They are actually a battery. Morty takes one look at the arrangement and calls it what it is, slavery with a couple of extra steps, and Rick does not really disagree. He just does not care. But it is not finished, and this is where it becomes dizzying. Down inside that microverse, there is a brilliant scientist, an alien named Zeep Zanflorp, and Zeep has independently solved his world's energy crisis in the exact same way Rick did. Zeep has built his own miniature universe, a miniverse, full of its own intelligent beings, and he powers his world by draining theirs, never realizing that his entire universe is itself just a battery inside a dead man's car. And then, because the story has the nerve to go one level deeper, we learn that inside Zeep's miniverse there is another scientist, named Kyle, who has built his own tiny universe, a teenyverse, and is draining that one. It is universes all the way down, a chain of creators each exploiting a smaller creation to survive, each one convinced they sit at the top, none of them aware they are somebody else's power source. Rick drains Zeep, Zeep drains Kyle, and Kyle drains someone smaller still. And the horrible joke is that Rick, sitting at the top of the chain we can see, is almost certainly not at the top of the chain at all. There is no reason to think the universe Rick lives in is not itself somebody's battery. That nested structure is one of the cleverest things the writers ever built because it takes Rick's central sin, the treatment of whole populations as resources, and reveals it as a universal law rather than a personal flaw. Rick is not a uniquely evil man exploiting the innocent. Rick is just one link in an infinite chain of exploitation, and the beings he exploits would do and are doing exactly the same thing to someone smaller. You are refused any chance to feel morally superior to Rick because the moment you side with the poor microverse people against the cruel god, you meet Zeep, who is a poor exploited victim and also a cruel god himself. Everyone in the chain is both, and that is a much colder idea than a simple story about a bad man with a battery. It suggests that exploitation is not a choice a villain makes. It is the structure of existence, the way intelligence relates to whatever is beneath it, all the way up and all the way down, forever. Set against that cosmic bleakness, there is a much smaller machine that somehow says the same thing in one line, and it is my favorite piece of writing in the entire series. In the 9th episode of the first season, an episode called Something Rick This Way Comes, Rick builds a little robot at the breakfast table whose only function is to pass butter. The robot rolls over, hands the butter across the table, and then looks at its own hands and asks Rick what its purpose is. Rick tells it plainly that its purpose is to pass butter. The robot pauses, looks at its hands again and says, "Oh my God." And Rick, without a shred of comfort, just replies, "Welcome to the club, pal." That is the whole scene. A machine achieves consciousness, immediately understands that its entire existence is devoted to one trivial, meaningless task, and despairs, and its creator tells it that meaningless existence is simply the condition of being alive. Join the crowd. It is a throwaway gag that happens to contain the entire philosophy of the show. Consciousness is a curse, purpose is a joke, and the only honest response to being told why you exist is, "Oh my God, the Meeseeks at least get to die when they finish." The butter robot has to keep passing the butter. Let me pull back the curtain on how some of this was actually made because a few of the most beloved sequences were not written in the traditional sense at all, and knowing that changes how you hear them. There is a recurring format in the early seasons built around interdimensional cable, a device Rick hooks up to the family television that pulls in broadcasts from across the multiverse. An endless stream of alien channels showing alien commercials, alien movies, and alien game shows. The two big examples are an episode in the first season called Rixty Minutes and one in the second season built entirely around interdimensional cable. And this is the hidden fact. Those alien television segments were, to a very large degree, not scripted. Justin Roiland improvised them, sitting in a recording booth for hours at a stretch, inventing alien products and characters off the top of his head, riffing for 4 or 5 hours at a time, and the animators would then take the funniest fragments of those marathon sessions and build animation around them. The strange, shapeless, wonderfully random quality of those segments, the sense that anything might happen and no joke has a setup, comes directly from the fact that they were made up on the spot by one man talking to himself. I find that fascinating as a piece of craft, because it is a completely different way of building comedy than the rest of the show. Most of Rick and Morty is famously tight, plotted to the second, every beat load bearing, and then these cable segments are the exact opposite, pure improvised chaos, a release valve of total randomness stitched into an otherwise precision-engineered machine. It could afford to do that because Roiland had a specific gift for stream of consciousness invention. And rather than fight it, the production built entire episodes designed to capture it raw. The format was eventually retired after the second season, which is part of why those early cable episodes feel like artifacts of a particular moment. A thing the series did when it was still loose enough to hand a microphone to one person and let him ramble into the void for an afternoon. If you have ever wondered why those segments feel so unlike anything else, that is why. They are the closest the finished series ever gets to just being one guy messing around. The same spirit of throwing something at the wall produced one of the genuine cultural moments in the 5th episode of the 2nd season, an episode called Get Swifty. The plot is gloriously stupid in the best way. Giant floating heads appear in the sky over Earth, cosmic beings called cromulons, and they announce that the planet is now a contestant in an intergalactic music competition. And if Earth fails to impress them with an original song, the planet will be destroyed. So Rick and Morty are drafted to save the world by writing a hit, and the song they come up with, a deliberately lazy, crude little number called Get Swifty, actually works and saves the planet. What is funny about this in hindsight is that a throwaway joke song written for a cartoon about an alien talent show became a real piece of music that fans adore, released as an actual track, a case of the fake in-universe pop hit escaping into the real world and becoming an actual one. The line between the show inventing dumb ephemera and that ephemera becoming culturally real is a line this series crosses constantly, and Get Swifty is one of the cleanest examples. There is a related invention I have to mention because it produced one of the more understated, profound half hours the writers ever made, and it lives at an alien arcade called Blips and Chits. Blips and Chits turns up in the 2nd season as a garish, neon, chaotic entertainment complex, a place Rick drags Morty to blow off steam full of bizarre alien games. And the crown jewel of the arcade is a game called Roy, a full immersion virtual reality experience where you put on a headset and live an entire human life, from childhood to death, as a man named Roy, experiencing decades of a whole existence in the span of a play session, and then you take the headset off and you are back in the arcade holding your score. It sounds like a gag, and at first it is played as one. But the writers came back to that game years later in the 2nd episode of the 6th season and turned the Roy machine into something much heavier, using the idea of living a full simulated life to say something about escape and consequence and whether a life lived inside a machine counts as a life at all. That is the move this show makes over and over. It plants a silly toy in an early season, a joke arcade cabinet, and then years later it picks the toy back up and finds the tragedy that was always hiding inside it. The writers love to plant an unanswerable question and then refuse permanently to answer it. And the best example concerns Rick's daughter, Beth, because there are now 2 of her, and the story has made it structurally impossible to ever know which one is which. This happens in the finale of the 4th season, the same episode where Rick kills Tammy. Beth, who has spent her whole life feeling trapped by the family, torn between wanting to run off into the cosmos and adventure the way her father does and wanting to stay and be a mother, is offered a way out of the dilemma by Rick. He offers to make a clone of her so that one Beth can go live a wild life in space while the other stays home with the family, and both can be real, both can be her. Beth agrees, or at least a Beth agrees, and from that point on there are 2 Beths, one who leaves to become a space adventurer, whom the fandom calls Space Beth, and one who stays behind with Jerry and the kids. Now here's the part that people constantly get wrong, and it is the whole point of the storyline, so it is worth being precise. There is a strong instinct to say that Space Beth is the clone and Home Beth is the original, or the other way around. That is made impossible to determine on purpose, because Rick, after creating the clone, did something very deliberate. He erased his own knowledge of which Beth is which. He shuffled them, scrambled the record, and wiped the information from his own mind, so that even he, the man who built the clone, does not know and cannot know which of the 2 women is the original and which is the copy. And if the creator does not know, no one knows. There is no test, no marker, no hidden truth waiting to be revealed in a later season. The knowledge was destroyed at the source on purpose. Both Beths are, in every way that can ever be checked, equally real and equally Rick's daughter. Neither has a stronger claim to being the true Beth than the other. I think that is one of the more radical things the series has done, and it is easy to miss what a strong statement it is. Our entire intuition about clones in fiction is that there is a real one and a fake one, an original and an imitation, and the drama comes from telling them apart. Rick and Morty takes that intuition and deliberately dynamites it. By destroying the information, Rick makes the question meaningless. The distinction between original and copy does not just become unknown, it becomes non-existent because a difference that can never, even in principle, be detected by anyone including the person who created it, is not really a difference at all. Both women are Beth, The argument, made without fanfare, is that identity is not some essence hidden in your cells that a clone would lack. It is just the continuous experience of being you, and both Beths have that in full. So when you hear someone say Space Beth is the clone, you can gently know they have missed the entire meaning of the plot. That was the one fact the story went out of its way to make permanently unknowable. The same anxiety about copies and originals runs through another idea, one introduced in the 5th season, the Decoys. In the 2nd episode of that season, an episode called Mortiplicity, we learn that Rick, being paranoid and thorough, long ago built decoy versions of his entire family, artificial copies designed to be indistinguishable from the real Smiths, so that if assassins came for them, they would kill the decoys instead. Fine, a sensible bit of Rick paranoia. Except the episode reveals that the decoys, being perfect copies, are also paranoid and thorough. So the decoy family built their own decoys, and those decoys built decoys. And the whole thing spirals into a recursive nightmare of copies of copies of copies. Families of Smiths who each believe they are the real one, hunting and being hunted, none of them able to prove their own authenticity. It is played for dark comedy, but it rhymes with the Beth question in a way I do not think is accidental. Over and over, this series returns to the same unsettling suspicion that in a universe of infinite copies and perfect duplicates and clone daughters, the very idea of an original, a real one, a true self underneath it all might be a comforting fiction. You think you are the real you, so does every decoy, so does every Beth, and not one of them can prove it. While we are on the family, there are 2 members who deserve a quiet corner of this, because their arcs are almost entirely overlooked, and yet they are 2 of the most complete character studies in Rick and Morty, and they are the dog and the son-in-law, the dog first. In the 2nd episode of the 1st season, an episode called Lawnmower Dog, Rick, to shut Jerry up about the family pet, builds a little helmet that boosts the intelligence of the family dog, whose name is Snuffles. And Rick, being Rick, keeps tinkering, keeps turning up the dial, and Snuffles gets smarter and smarter until he is fully sapient, self-aware, and deeply, coldly aware of his own situation, which is that he is a proud, intelligent being who has spent his whole life on a leash, wearing a collar, being told he is a good boy, defecating in the yard while his owners watch. He builds himself a suit of powered armor, he rallies the other dogs of the neighborhood, and he launches an uprising, an intelligent dog rebellion against the humans who kept them as pets. Now here is the part that makes Snowball, which is the name the dog chooses for himself once he is free, rejecting Snuffles as a slave name given to him by owners, one of the series' most graceful creations. He wins, the dogs take control. And then, at the height of his power, with humanity at his mercy, Snowball chooses not to rule. He decides that dogs and humans cannot share a world as equals, that the cycle of one species mastering another is not something he wants to continue with the roles simply reversed, and so instead of conquering Earth, he leads his fellow uplifted dogs through a portal to another dimension, a world of their own where dogs can build a civilization free of humans entirely. It is a noble ending, and it is the opposite of what Rick would have done. Given absolute power, Snowball's response is to walk away from domination rather than perpetuate it, to seek a clean, separate freedom rather than a throne built on revenge. The dog turns out to be more principled than any Rick in the multiverse, and he is simply allowed to leave peacefully for a better world and never dragged back. There is no ongoing dog empire menacing Earth. He got his freedom and he was done. Then there is Jerry, and I want to give Jerry his due because it is fashionable to dismiss him and the writing itself is often cruel to him. But Jerry is doing something in this series that nobody else is, which is surviving without being exceptional. Every other major character is a genius, a warrior, a mastermind, a superhuman of some kind. Jerry is aggressively, almost heroically ordinary, a man of average intelligence and average ambition trying to hold a marriage and a family together in a household that also contains the most dangerous being in the universe. And the treatment of him is complicated. Sometimes he is a punching bag, a symbol of mediocrity that Rick despises. But every so often the lens turns around and suggests that Jerry's ordinariness is a kind of strength, that his capacity for simple happiness, for loving his wife and his kids without needing to conquer the cosmos, is a thing Rick can neither understand nor achieve. We saw it earlier with Doofus Rick, the gentle Rick who bonds with Jerry precisely because the two of them share a decency the geniuses have burned out of themselves. Jerry is the control group in the experiment. He is what a person looks like without the genius and without the damage that the genius seems to require. And the quiet question the series keeps asking through him is whether Rick, if he could trade all his brilliance for Jerry's ability to just be content, would take the deal. And the honest answer it keeps circling is that he might, and that he hates Jerry partly because Jerry has, for free, the one thing all of Rick's intelligence could never buy. We should talk about the one time the series blew up its entire status quo in a single episode, because it happened at the edge of most people's memory of the series, and it is one of the most consequential things that ever occurred in the canon. Back at the end of the second season, in that same wedding where Bird Person was murdered, the Galactic Federation, a vast interstellar bureaucratic empire, moved in and took over Earth. They annexed the planet, installed themselves in every institution, put an alien administration in charge of human life, and Rick, cornered, surrendered himself into their custody and went to prison to protect his family. So the third season opens with Earth under occupation, Rick locked in a Federation prison, and the whole board seemingly flipped against him. And then the third season premiere, an episode called The Rickshank Rickdemption, undoes all of it in 22 minutes, and the way Rick does it tells you everything about how his mind works. Rick does not fight his way out with weapons. He breaks out by hacking minds, and more importantly, by attacking the one thing an empire actually runs on, which is not its army but its money. Once he is loose, Rick gets into the Federation's financial systems and with a single stroke, sets their galactic currency to be worth nothing, not less, nothing, zero. He crashes the entire economy of an interstellar empire in an instant, and an empire whose money is suddenly worthless cannot pay its soldiers, cannot fund its occupation, cannot hold itself together, and the whole Galactic Federation collapses and pulls out of Earth in a panic, undone not by a war, but by a monetary trick. It is a brilliant piece of writing about how power actually functions, the idea that the strongest empire in the galaxy is not held up by its guns, but by a shared fiction about the value of its currency, and if you can destroy the fiction, you destroy the empire without firing a shot. Rick understood that the Federation's real weakness was belief, and he poisoned the belief. In that same episode, Rick also settles his account with the other great power that had been hunting him, the Citadel of Ricks, and this is the beat that clears the way for everything we discussed earlier about Evil Morty. Rick, from inside his mental prison break, manages to strike at the Council of Ricks that had spent so long trying to control and frame him, and the Council is destroyed, the old ruling body of the Citadel wiped out. So in one single episode, Rick eliminates both of the institutions that had defined the show's power structure, the Galactic Federation and the Council of Ricks, the Outer Empire and the Inner One. And crucially, that destruction of the Council is what creates the power vacuum in the Citadel that Evil Morty later walks into and fills. When we watched Evil Morty run for president of a rebuilding Citadel, the reason it was rebuilding, the reason there was an election to win at all, is that Rick had smashed the old order first. The pieces connect. Rick knocked down the Council, the Citadel had to reinvent itself as a kind of democracy, and that democracy was exactly the machine Evil Morty needed to seize power legitimately. Rick's revenge on the Council unknowingly built the ladder his own grandson's counterpart climbed to the top. There is a lovely piece of real-world trivia attached to the season that all this kicked off, and it is a good example of its mischievous relationship with its own audience. The third season premiere, this very episode that toppled two empires, did not air on a normal announced schedule. Adult Swim dropped it as a surprise on the 1st of April, on April Fool's Day, running it unannounced on a loop so that fans who tuned in expecting a prank instead got a genuine new episode of a series they had been starved of for a long stretch. The gap between seasons had been long and painful for the fandom, and the network turned the return into a prank that was not a prank. A joke where the punchline was the thing you actually wanted. It fits the series' personality exactly, and it meant the episode that reset the entire series arrived with no warning at all, discovered rather than scheduled, which only added to its reputation as a bolt from the blue that changed everything. The mechanics of how Rick actually gets around deserve their own careful pass, because there is a widespread misconception about it, and the truth is more interesting than the myth. People often talk about the portal gun as if it runs on some exotic cosmic substance. And you will hear it said that it is powered by concentrated dark matter, but that is a conflation of two different things. Concentrated dark matter is a fuel Rick uses for faster than light space travel for his ship, a separate system entirely. The portal gun runs on portal fluid, sometimes rendered as a quantum solution, a specific liquid stored in a vial on the device, and that fluid is what lets it tear a hole from one reality to another. This distinction matters because the fluid is a genuine plot element with real consequences. It is dangerous, it is regulated, and on the Citadel, where portal technology is controlled, the official fluid is restricted, which, as with any restricted substance, creates a black market. There is bootleg portal fluid out there, cheap knockoff solution for Ricks and others who cannot get the real thing. And the bootleg fluid does not just make a slightly worse portal, it kills you. This becomes a genuine plot point in the premiere of the 6th season, an episode called Solarix, where we learn the ugly truth about the counterfeit stuff. A portal made with bootleg fluid will open, but passing through it disintegrates the traveler, dissolves them in transit, so that the black market solution is essentially a death sentence disguised as a discount. It is a small, grim detail that tells you a lot about the world, that even the miraculous technology of tearing open realities has a seedy underbelly, a counterfeit economy, a way for the desperate to get themselves killed trying to save a little money. The portal gun, the most magical object in the series, turns out to have exactly the same problems as any tightly controlled valuable resource in the real world: scarcity, regulation, smuggling, and lethal fakes. That same 6th season premiere does something devastating with Rick's origins, and it is worth handling gently because the show itself is deliberately ambiguous about the exact geography of it. As a consequence of events at the end of the 5th season, a kind of reset ripples out that sends various travelers back to their true original dimensions, the realities they actually came from before all the dimension hopping scrambled everyone's histories. And this is where we finally glimpse where Rick truly comes from. The origin dimension, the place where Diane and young Beth died. What we find there is unbearably sad. Rick's origin reality is a place he has essentially turned into a monument to his grief, a version of the world locked into the loop of the worst day of his life. And within it, there is a Diane, but not a living one. It is an artificial Diane, a simulation, an intelligence Rick built in the shape of his dead wife, a voice and a presence he manufactured because the real one exists nowhere in all of creation. He cannot have her, so he built a ghost of her and keeps it in the ruins of where she died. That is the thing to hold on to, and it ties straight back to the Omega device. When Rick encounters a Diane in that origin dimension, it is crucial to understand that she is not a variant, not a surviving version, not a living woman he could have gone to all along. She is a construct of his own making, an artificial intelligence wearing her face precisely because a real Diane does not exist anywhere to be found. Every Diane you will ever see in Rick and Morty is either the memory of the one who died or a simulation he built to sit with in his grief. There is no reunion available to him, no reality to escape to, only recordings and recreations of a woman erased from the whole of infinity. Rick, the man who can go anywhere and do anything, who broke out of a prison by crashing an economy and toppled 2 empires in one afternoon, cannot do the one thing he wants most, which is to find his wife alive somewhere in the endless multiverse, because his enemy made certain that the endless multiverse does not contain her. So he built a fake, and he sits with the fake in the ruins on a loop, and that is the loneliest image it has ever offered. Let me turn to the episodes that broke out of the fandom and into the wider culture, because a couple of them carry hidden facts about how it is regarded that a lot of casual viewers never clock. The most famous is almost certainly Pickle Rick, the 3rd episode of the 3rd season, in which Rick, to avoid attending a family therapy session, turns himself into a pickle. That is the whole absurd premise, a man who would rather transform his entire body into a brine vegetable than sit in a room and talk about his feelings. And it becomes an action extravaganza as Pickle Rick, unable to move on his own, Jury rigs himself a body out of dead rats and insects and fights his way through a building. It became a meme, a shorthand, arguably the most recognizable thing the series ever produced for people who have never watched it. But here's the fact worth knowing. Pickle Rick is not just popular, it is decorated. It won Rick and Morty its first Emmy, the award for Outstanding Animated Program, a real, serious industry honor for an episode about a man turning into a pickle to skip therapy. And that is a perfect encapsulation of its whole trick, dressing genuine emotional weight, in this case a man's pathological avoidance of self-examination, in the most ridiculous possible costume, and being taken seriously precisely because the ridiculousness is the point. Because the therapy angle is the part people forget when they reduce Pickle Rick to a meme, and it is the part that earned the award. The episode is not really about the pickle. It is about the fact that Rick was willing to undertake an insane, dangerous, elaborate scientific transformation to literally stop being human, rather than spend 1 hour being honest in a therapist's office. The therapist, a woman named Dr. Wong, gets a monologue near the end that cuts straight through Rick's whole persona. A plain-spoken diagnosis of a man who treats maintenance and vulnerability and ordinary emotional work as beneath him, as boring, as unworthy of his genius, when in truth he avoids them because they are the only things that actually frighten him. She names the thing the entire show is about, that Rick's endless cleverness is, at bottom, an elaborate machine for avoiding the simple, unglamorous work of being a person. He would rather be a pickle. The gag and the theme are the same thing. That is why it won. A second Emmy for Outstanding Animated Program came a couple of years later for an episode in the 4th season called The Vat of Acid episode, and that one is a much more slept-on masterpiece, a piece of writing so clever it almost hides how dark it is. The premise begins with Rick, annoyed at Morty for doubting one of his schemes, giving Morty what looks like a fake vat of acid to hide in, a trick to fool people into thinking he has died so he can escape situations. But Morty asks for something more like a save point, the ability to save his position in life like a video game and return to it, and Rick builds it, and Morty starts using it to redo his days, to live and reset, and it spirals into a meditation on consequence and regret that ends in a disturbing place about how many lives Morty carelessly ruins and abandons with each reset. It is a quieter, stranger, more experimental episode than Pickle Rick, and the fact that both took home the same major award tells you the series' range, that it could win for a loud action romp about a pickle and for a cerebral puzzle box about the ethics of a save button. While we are on beloved episodes, I have to give a moment to the Vindicators because they produced one of the best loved side characters through pure comic timing. In the 4th episode of the 3rd season, an episode called Vindicators 3, Rick and Morty get roped into an adventure with a team of superheroes, a clear parody of the big screen superhero teams that were dominating cinemas, all posturing and catchphrases and self-importance. Rick, who despises them, gets blackout drunk and, in his stupor, rigs the whole mission into a deranged, deadly puzzle game in the style of a horror franchise, forcing the smug heroes to survive his traps. And out of all of this, the character who emerges as the fan favorite is not any of the grand heroes, but Noob Noob, a lowly, cheerful, put-upon member of the team's support staff, the guy who cleans up and gets no respect. At the end, Rick delivers a speech about who on the team actually earned his admiration, and it is not the powerful ones, it is Noob Noob, the little guy nobody valued, because Noob Noob was kind to Rick when Rick was at his worst and expected nothing back. It is a small joke with a real heart in it, the series once again pointing at the overlooked figure in the corner and saying, that one, that is the one who matters, which is the same instinct that made a background Morty into the most important character in the mythology. Now we come to the hardest real-world chapter in the show's history, and I want to handle it plainly and neutrally, sticking to what is documented, because it is the single biggest behind-the-scenes event the series has ever weathered. Remember the fact I asked you to hold on to near the beginning, that for the first 6 seasons, one man, Justin Roiland, voiced both Rick and Morty. Roiland was also a co-creator, alongside Dan Harmon, and by any measure, he was central to it, its co-founder, the voice of both leads, a guiding creative force. In January of 2023, Adult Swim cut ties with him. The network announced it had ended its association with Roiland, removing him from the series entirely. The context, as reported at the time, was that Roiland was facing felony domestic violence charges, which had been filed a couple of years earlier and had recently become public, and additional allegations of misconduct had surfaced alongside them. The charges were later dropped in the spring of that same year, by the county prosecutor citing insufficient evidence to proceed. But by then, the professional separation was already done. Adult Swim had moved on, and so had the show. I am going to be careful here because this involves a real person and real accusations, and the responsible thing is to report only what is documented and to speculate about none of it. The charges were filed, they became public. The network ended the relationship. The charges were later dropped for insufficient evidence. Those are the facts, stated flatly, and the private truth of what did or did not happen between real people is not something a lore video has any business guessing at. What we can talk about is the extraordinary production problem this created, because it is without much precedent. Here was a show whose two title characters, appearing in nearly every scene, talking to each other constantly, were both voiced by the person who had just been removed. Losing that one voice meant losing both leads simultaneously, the entire vocal identity of the series. Overnight, most shows that lose a lead actor lose one character. Rick and Morty lost its whole central duet in a single stroke. What the production did in response is subtly remarkable, and it started before most of the audience even knew there was a problem. Adult Swim launched a talent search to recast both roles, looking for performers who could match Roiland's specific vocal texture, the slurring cadence of Rick, the anxious crack of Morty, closely enough that the transition would not shatter Rick and Morty. The roles went to two actors, Ian Cardoni taking over as Rick and Harry Belden taking over as Morty, and the mandate was clearly to preserve continuity, to make the new voices as seamless a match as possible so that the characters would still sound like themselves. Starting with the 7th season, these were the voices of Rick and Morty, and the striking thing, the thing that became its own talking point when the season aired, is how close the match is. A great many viewers report that if you did not know a recast had happened, you might not notice, or might only sense that something was very slightly different without being able to say what. The new performers studied the roles and delivered impersonations precise enough to keep its most fundamental element, the sound of its two leads, essentially intact. The credits also softly changed, with the created by credit that had carried Roiland's name adjusted to reflect the new reality. There is something a little eerie and a little poignant about all of it, and it rhymes strangely with the series' own themes, though I want to be careful not to be glib about a serious situation. This is a series obsessed with the idea of replacements, with the notion that a person can be swapped for a near identical version and life simply carries on, that our very Morty is a replacement, that Beth was cloned into two, that Rick built Decoys indistinguishable from the real thing. And then the production itself had to do exactly that in reality, replace its two central voices with near identical substitutes and keep going as if nothing fundamental had changed. The fiction had spent a decade insisting that the copy is as real as the original, that continuity of experience matters more than the essence underneath, and then the people making it live that idea out under the worst possible circumstances. Rick and Morty had always argued that you can lose the original and carry on with something that sounds the same. When it came time to test that argument on itself, it did precisely what it had always said the universe does. It replaced what it lost, and it kept going. Let me tell you about the time a cartoon joke caused actual chaos in the real world, because it is one of the strangest things ever to happen to this show, and it began with a throwaway gag. Cast your mind back to that surprise April Fool's 3rd season premiere, the one that toppled the Federation. Buried in that same episode, in the middle of all the reality-altering plot, Rick goes on a manic tangent about a condiment. He becomes fixated on a specific McDonald's dipping sauce called Szechuan sauce, a limited edition sauce the chain had actually released back in 1998 as a promotional tie, in for the Disney film Mulan, long discontinued and mostly forgotten. In the episode, Rick declares that getting that sauce back is essentially his one true motivation, the thing that drives him. A deliberately absurd anticlimax, a genius reducing his life's purpose to a nostalgic fast food dip. It was written as a joke about how petty and fixated Rick can be, a satire of nostalgia and consumer obsession. It was never meant to be a literal demand. The fans took it as a literal demand. The bit landed so hard that a genuine grassroots clamor rose up for McDonald's to actually bring the sauce back, a real-world campaign born from a cartoon punchline, and McDonald's, sensing a marketing opportunity, decided to oblige, at least a little. In the autumn of that year, on the 7th of October in 2017, the chain announced it would bring Szechuan sauce back for a single day at participating locations. And what happened next was a small disaster. The demand vastly outstripped the supply. Stores had been given only a tiny number of packets, a handful per location, and enormous crowds of fans showed up expecting to get some. And the whole thing collapsed into chaos. Long lines, sold-out stores within minutes. Angry crowds, people who had driven long distances turned away empty-handed. Some furious scenes outside restaurants. The rollout was so badly judged relative to the frenzy the series had created that it became a news story in its own right, a fast food promotion that turned into public unrest over a dipping sauce, all because of a joke in a cartoon. McDonald's ended up apologizing and later did wider, better-stocked re-releases of the sauce to make up for the fiasco, but the damage and the legend were already done. And I think it is one of the most remarkable things about Rick and Morty as a cultural object that it reached a level of influence where an offhand line of dialogue could reach out of the screen and bend the behavior of a multinational corporation and send crowds into the streets over a condiment. There is a real irony folded into it too that is almost too perfect. The joke was a satire of mindless nostalgia and consumer craving, Rick reducing himself to a man who would do anything for a taste of a discontinued product from his past. And the audience responded by mindlessly, cravingly demanding the exact discontinued product, becoming the precise thing the joke was mocking. The satire of consumerism became a triumph of consumerism. The show made fun of people who would riot for a nostalgic sauce, and its fans rioted for a nostalgic sauce. I am not sure the writers could have designed a better proof of the very point they were making, and I doubt they are entirely comfortable with having proved it. It is worth sitting with what that episode reveals about the strange size the show had reached by its third season, because the sauce thing did not happen in a vacuum. This was a series that had grown from a crude internet short and an Adult Swim slot into something with real gravitational pull on the wider culture. A show whose catchphrases were everywhere, whose fan base was intense enough to be a genuine phenomenon and, at its worst edges, intense enough to worry the very people making it. The Szechuan sauce affair sits right at the hinge of that, the moment it became undeniable that Rick and Morty was no longer just a cult cartoon, but a machine capable of moving the real world, for better and for worse. A joke about a sauce became a corporate event, a news cycle, and a small cautionary tale about what happens when a satire becomes more popular than the thing it was satirizing, until the audience can no longer tell whether they are laughing at the joke or living inside it. Let me gather up a handful of the smaller hidden details now, the kind of thing that lives in single frames and passing gags, because the title promised hidden facts and some of the best ones are tiny. Start with the opening titles, because there is a game being played with you in the credits since very early on that a lot of people never notice. The intro sequence changes every season, a new montage of quick clips set to the theme. But those clips are not just decoration, and they are not simply footage from the season you are about to watch. Two kinds of shots get mixed together in the opening. Some are genuine glimpses of real upcoming footage, actual moments from episodes in that season, and others are one-off gags animated purely for the intro that never appear in any episode at all, little scenes that exist only in the credits and nowhere else. So fans have spent years combing the opening frame by frame, trying to guess which flashes are real previews and which are throwaways, which images are promises the season will keep, and which are jokes that go nowhere. It is a small, deliberate act of misdirection baked into the very first seconds of every season, teasing you with a mix of truth and fiction before the episode even starts. Here's a piece of trivia that surprises people who only think of Rick and Morty as an Adult Swim show. The team behind it once animated a guest sequence for The Simpsons. For a Simpsons episode that aired back in 2015, they produced a couch gag, one of those short opening bits where the Simpson family sits down on their couch, and the version they made was gloriously, gratuitously gory in a way The Simpsons itself never is, involving Rick and Morty crash landing into the Simpsons world, and things going horribly, messily wrong. It is a strange little crossover artifact, the crude interdimensional cartoon getting invited into the most establishment animated show on television and responding by covering the place in guts. If you have never seen it, it is worth seeking out as a curiosity, a moment where the upstart and the institution briefly shared a frame, Then there are the deep-cut characters who reward close attention, and my favorite of the obscure ones is a creation named Abradolf Linkler. He shows up in the 11th episode of the first season, an episode called Rixie Business, and he is exactly what his name suggests, a genetic hybrid Rick created by splicing together Abraham Lincoln and Adolf Hitler in an attempt to make a perfectly morally neutral being, the idea being that the best and worst of human morality would cancel each other out into something balanced. Naturally, the experiment does not produce a serene moral centrist, it produces a confused, volatile monster, and Abradolf Linkler storms off. He appears to die in a later encounter, but a small tag slips in suggesting he actually survived. And his ultimate fate is left unresolved, one of those loose threads the series dropped and never definitively tied off. I mention him partly because he is a great gag and partly as an honesty check, because it would be easy to claim a clean canonical death for him, and the truthful answer is that the series never gave one. He is a hybrid of the noblest and most monstrous figures in human memory, created as an experiment in moral neutrality, and then more or less forgotten, which is its own kind of joke about how little Rick cares about the horrors he casually manufactures. And a couple more quick ones to file away, because they are the sort of detail that makes a rewatch richer. Part of what makes the Citadel material reward attention is how many individual Ricks and Mortys have their own tiny visual quirks, marking them out in crowd shots, an entire background population the animators individuated on purpose. There is also a long-running fondness for burying signs of Rick's depression in the set design and the throwaway lines rather than the plot, so that the darkness is often literally in the wallpaper if you look. And the whole series is threaded with the idea that the opening seconds of an episode, the cold opens before the theme, are frequently disconnected little adventures unrelated to the plot. A structural quirk that lets the writers do a wild, self-contained sketch and then get on with the actual story, which is part of why an episode can feel like it contains far more incident than its short runtime should allow. None of these are load-bearing revelations on their own. Together, they are the texture that makes people watch these episodes 10 times. And that texture, that density of hidden small things, is exactly what a slow, quiet trawl like this one exists to appreciate. I want to spend some time on Morty himself, the actual boy, because the writers do something with him over the years that sneaks up on you, and they hide one of the saddest ideas inside an episode built around memory. Morty is Rick's 14-year-old grandson, and when the series begins, he is exactly the anxious, stammering, decent kid the format needs, a normal boy dragged into cosmic horror. But if you watch closely across the seasons, Morty hardens. The things he sees, the things he is made to do, the bodies he helps bury, the deaths he causes and witnesses, accumulate on him, and the sweet, nervous kid slowly acquires a shell, a capacity for violence and detachment that in the early episodes he simply did not have. It is never rushed, the damage just settles year by year, so that the Morty of the later seasons is recognizably the same boy and also unmistakably a harder, colder, more capable person, someone who has been to too many terrible places to stay soft. Rick did not just take Morty on adventures. Rick raised him, and the show is honest about what kind of person that upbringing produces. The episode that crystallizes this is one about memory, the 8th episode of the 3rd season, an episode called Morty's Mind Blowers, and it is one of the cleverest structures the series has. It reveals that Rick keeps a secret room lined with vials, and each vial is a memory of Morty's that Morty himself asked Rick to remove, memories too painful or too traumatic or too shameful to live with, moments from their adventures so bad that Morty begged to have them erased from his own head. So there is a whole archive of Morty's suffering that Morty does not even remember experiencing, a wall of small horrors he chose to have taken out of himself just to keep functioning. Think about what that implies about the life this child leads, that the adventures are so frequently traumatic that he has needed a room full of them surgically deleted from his mind, that his ability to keep going at all depends on not remembering most of the worst things that have happened to him. The comedy of the series, the wacky sci-fi romps, are revealed to have a cost, and the cost is a shelf of jars holding everything the boy could not bear to keep. And the episode ends with an unsettling turn because in the chaos of sorting through these memories, Both Rick and Morty end up accidentally getting their own recent memories wiped, and they wake up with no idea who they are, no memory of their relationship, and have to piece together from context that they are a grandfather and grandson who apparently do this, whatever this is, together. It is played partly for laughs, but sit with the image, the two central characters stripped of all memory of each other, blank, staring at photographs trying to figure out who they are supposed to be. It gently asks whether the bond between them is something essential or something that could simply be erased and rebuilt or lost entirely, whether they would even choose each other again if the accumulated history were gone. No answer is offered. They just stumble back toward their lives with the question hanging. That anxiety, the fear underneath Morty about how much of himself is tangled up in Rick, becomes the spine of the 7th season finale, an episode the fandom calls Fear No Mort, and I want to be careful about how I describe it because it plays deliberate tricks and I do not want to state its illusions as facts. Without spoiling its every turn, the finale is built around Morty's fears, and it probes with real precision the thing Morty is most frightened of, which is not monsters or death, but the extent of his own dependence on his grandfather, how much of his identity and his safety and his sense of himself has been built around Rick, and what would be left of him without it. The episode uses its toolkit of illusions and fake outs to force Morty and us to look directly at that dependence. It is not a plot-heavy finale in the way some others are. It is a psychological one, a season ending on the interior of the boy rather than the exterior of the mythology, which is itself a statement about where the series' heart had moved by that point, away from cosmic plot machinery and back toward the small, terrifying question of what these two people actually are to each other, and what it has done to a child to be needed by a man like Rick. Let me lay out the shape of the series as a whole, the plain production skeleton, because the scale and the rhythm of it are part of the hidden story, and the way it was made explains a lot about how it feels. Rick and Morty premiered, as we said, in December of 2013, and it is run in seasons of roughly 10 episodes each, with the first season being the longest at 11. What strikes me looking at the timeline is the gaps. The early seasons came with long, sometimes agonizing waits between them, stretches of a year and a half or more where fans had nothing but reruns and rumors. The second season arrived in 2015, the third in 2017 after that surprise April Fool's drop, and each of those waits became its own fandom event, a drought that made the eventual return feel enormous. Those gaps were partly a function of how it is made, painstakingly, with a small core creative team obsessing over scripts through many drafts, a process that simply does not produce episodes quickly. The density we keep coming back to, the feature film of plot crammed into 22 minutes, is expensive in time. You cannot rush writing that tight. Then something changed in the deal, and it changed the whole tempo of the series. In 2018, Adult Swim made an enormous commitment, ordering a huge block of additional episodes all at once, a long-term arrangement for something on the order of 70 more episodes, a guarantee of many seasons to come. That order transformed Rick and Morty from a show that might vanish after any season into an institution with a runway of years ahead of it. And you can feel the difference in the later seasons, which arrive more regularly, roughly annually, the long droughts replaced by a steadier rhythm. It went from a precarious cult object that fans feared might not come back to a reliably returning fixture of the schedule. And the commitments kept growing. Years later, the network renewed it yet again, extending the run further still into the future, well past where we are now, so that as things stand, there is a substantial life still ahead of it, more seasons ordered than have aired. I will be honest about the edges of this because the exact final season and the exact end year are the kind of thing reported as estimates and then shifted. So rather than commit to a hard endpoint, I will simply say the series is contracted well beyond its current run and is not going anywhere soon. The mythology also spilled out beyond the television episodes into forms a lot of viewers never touch, and these are part of the canon conversation even when Rick and Morty keeps them at arm's length. There is a substantial run of comic books, an ongoing Rick and Morty comic series that ran for years, along with a line of one-shot specials, telling stories in this world on the page rather than the screen. And while their exact canonical standing is loose, they are a real and sizable body of storytelling that exists parallel to the episodes. And more strikingly, there is an anime. In 2024, Adult Swim aired a separate series called Rick and Morty. The Anime, a Japanese animated take on the property directed by Takashi Sano, produced in an anime idiom rather than the usual American style, telling its own stories in its own register. It is a fascinating object, the series' sensibility filtered through a completely different animation tradition, and it reflects something the series had been flirting with for years in its own episodes. A real affection for anime that shows up again and again in parody and homage. Because that is the other thing worth naming here, how deeply the show wears its love of anime and of genre on its sleeve, right down to episode structures built as full parodies. There is the 5th season finale, Rick Murai Jack, whose very title nods to the animated series Samurai Jack, and which opens with a loving parody of an anime opening sequence. And there is an episode from that same season that stages an elaborate homage to giant robot anime, the mecha genre, complete with the emotional beats those shows are known for. Underneath its crude American cartoon surface, this is a magpie, constantly borrowing and parodying the forms it admires, from Japanese animation to superhero blockbusters to 80s films to horror franchises, and part of the pleasure of watching it closely is catching which genre it has decided to inhabit and dismantle that week. The thing that began life as a riff on a time travel movie never stopped being, at its core, a parody engine, a machine for putting Rick and Morty inside whatever story it feels like taking apart. And the anime and the comics are just that same impulse spilling past the boundaries of the main show into whole other media. Let me do a careful roll call now of who is actually still standing in this world, because the series kills people constantly and revives them almost as often, and the fandom gets the current status of the supporting cast wrong all the time. We have already walked through the big ones. Bird Person died at his wedding, became the cyborg the fans call Phoenix Person, and was restored to genuine life in the 5th season, so his status, contrary to what a lot of people assume, is alive. Tammy, the agent who murdered him, is dead, shot by Rick in the 4th season finale, and she does not come back as some ongoing schemer afterward. Mr. Poopy Butthole, despite being shot by Beth, is alive and real and a permanent fixture. The dog, Snowball, is alive and gone, off building a canine civilization in another dimension rather than menacing Earth. 2 Beths are alive, one in space and one at home, and it has been made permanently impossible to say which is the clone. That is the core ledger, and already it cuts against a lot of the assumptions people carry around. A few more to pin down. Squanchy, the cat-like alien friend of Rick's who peppers his speech with his own untranslatable verb, was at that same disastrous wedding and survived it, growing to enormous size to fight off the Federation forces. And he turns up again in the later seasons, so he is alive and well. Unity, the hive mind who broke Rick's heart and triggered his suicide attempt, was last seen leaving him, and as far as we have been told, remains out there somewhere. Alive in the sense that a planet-spanning collective consciousness is alive, though there has been no confirmed on-screen reunion since that 2nd season episode. So the honest status is alive but absent, a wound left open rather than a character brought back. The Galactic Federation as an institution is gone, collapsed after Rick crashed its currency, so any lingering sense that Earth is still under alien occupation is simply out of date. That empire fell in the 3rd season and has not risen again in the same form. The ordinary humans in Morty's life are worth a quick word too, because they are the anchor the cosmic material floats above. There is Morty's math teacher, a nervous man named Mr. Goldenfold, still teaching, still alive, occasionally pulled into the wider insanity against his will. There is the school's principal, a recurring figure the writers gave a deliberately ridiculous name, still presiding over the school in one version or another, despite the chaos the multiverse keeps visiting on the place. These characters rarely drive the plot, but their persistence matters, because they are the tether to the mundane, the reminder that beneath all the multiverse-spanning tragedy, Morty is still, technically, a kid who has to go to school and face a math teacher in the morning. The contrast between the roll call of dead and revived cosmic beings and the quiet continuity of a high school math class is a lot of what gives the show its particular flavor, the sublime and the utterly banal sharing the same street. What I take from this whole roll call is a pattern that says something about its relationship with death. and it is not the pattern you might expect from a series with this reputation for darkness. Rick and Morty kills characters with abandon, yes, but it is strikingly reluctant to make death stick when the character matters emotionally. Bird Person dies and comes back. Beth is not killed, but doubled. Poopy Butthole is shot and survives. Even Rick's own deaths, and there have been apparent ones, tend to have an escape hatch, a clone, a backup, a trick. The one death treated as truly cosmically permanent, the one it will not undo and structurally cannot undo, is Diane, precisely because the Omega device made her absence total across all of infinity. And I think that is deliberate and telling. In a universe where almost anyone can be brought back, cloned, rebuilt, or replaced, the writers reserve genuine, irreversible loss for the one person whose loss defines Rick. Everyone else gets a door left open. Diane gets a wall. The show is generous with resurrection everywhere except the one place it would actually heal its main character. And that stinginess, that single locked door in a house full of open ones, is a strikingly precise emotional choice. One of the finest in the whole run. Since this is a hidden facts video, it is only fair to spend some time separating the theories that turned out to be true from the ones the fandom clings to that are simply wrong, because something this dense breeds an enormous amount of speculation, and some of it aged into canon while some of it aged into embarrassment. Start with the theories that were vindicated. For years, from that very first Citadel episode, fans argued that the quiet Morty in the eye patch, the one who turned out to be controlling evil Rick, was going to become a major long-term antagonist, a mastermind operating across seasons. That theory was dismissed by plenty of people as reading too much into a one-off villain. It was completely correct. Evil Morty came back, seized the Citadel presidency, and drove the single biggest revelation in the mythology, the Central Finite Curve. The fans who called it were right, and years of patient speculation got rewarded when the whole thing paid off exactly as the theorists had hoped. That is a case where obsessive attention to a background character predicted the future of the series. Another one that swung from theory to confirmed fact concerns Rick's dead wife. For a long stretch, Rick and Morty deliberately made the story of Diane's murder uncertain, planting a suggestion in the third season that Rick had fabricated the whole tragic backstory as a manipulation, a fake origin invented to excuse himself. And fans split hard over it, some insisting the dead family was real and central, others convinced it was all a lie Rick told. The fifth season finale settled it in favor of the believers. The murder was real, the wife was real, the revenge quest was real, and the fabrication suggestion was itself the misdirection. So the theory that Rick's grief was genuine and load-bearing, not a con, turned out to be the truth. The writers played a long game of making you doubt their own emotional center, and the fans who trusted that the grief was real were vindicated. Now the theories and beliefs that are simply wrong, the ones you should let go of because they persist despite the series explicitly closing them off. The most common is the confident claim that the Smith family lives in dimension C-137, which we took apart near the start of tonight, and which remains the single most repeated error in the whole fandom. C-137 is Rick's label, the family's current home is the replacement world they moved to, and no amount of merchandise printing the number changes the canon. The second great error is the belief that Rick could, if he wanted, travel to a universe where Diane is alive, that somewhere in the infinite multiverse a living version of his wife waits to be found. That belief is not just unconfirmed, it is directly contradicted by the show, because the Omega device erased every version of Diane from every reality at once. There is no living Diane anywhere. Anyone who tells you Rick is simply too stubborn or too guilty to go find her has missed the most important negative fact in the series. He cannot find her. She does not exist to be found. A few more corrections worth stating cleanly because they come up constantly. There is no fixed number of universes in Rick and Morty, no matter how many videos confidently cite one. The multiverse is infinite, and the Central Finite Curve is defined not by a count, but by a quality. The universes where Rick is smartest, so any specific total you hear is invented. There is no way to determine which Beth is the clone, and anyone stating that Space Beth is the copy is asserting something the story made permanently unknowable on purpose. And the idea that some in-universe death of Rick explains the real world recasting is a conflation, tangling the behind-the-scenes voice change together with the series' own themes of decoys and replacements. The recast happened for documented real-world reasons we already covered, not because of a plot event. The healthy way to hold something this speculative is to love the theorizing while staying honest about which theories the canon actually confirmed, which it left open, and which it flatly closed, and to notice that the writers are usually a step ahead of their own audience, seeding the truth early and letting the wrong guesses collapse under the weight of later episodes. There is a single line in the first season that people quote as its entire philosophy, and I think it is worth slowing right down on because it is both exactly right and, on closer inspection, quietly incomplete. And the gap between those two things is the real subject of the whole series. It comes in that first season cable episode in a subplot where Summer, Morty's older sister, discovers that she was an unplanned pregnancy, that her parents only married and had the life they have because she was accidentally conceived, and she is devastated by the idea that her entire existence is a mistake, and she decides to run away. And Morty, of all people, the anxious younger brother, sits her down and talks her out of it. And the thing he tells her has become the series' most famous statement of belief. He tells her, in plain flat words, that nobody exists on purpose, that nobody belongs anywhere, that everybody is going to die, and then he invites her to come watch television with him. And to underline that he has earned the right to say it, he tells her what he has seen, that he comes from a world that was destroyed, that he watched himself die and buried his own body, and that he is not even the original Morty of this family, reaching all the way back to the Cronenberg catastrophe we walked through at the start. On the surface, that is pure nihilism, the series' whole worldview compressed into a bumper sticker. Nothing means anything, everyone dies, so stop agonizing and go be distracted. And a lot of people take it exactly that way, as Rick and Morty telling you that life is meaningless, and the mature response is to shrug and enjoy the ride. But look at what Morty is actually doing in that scene, because the content of his words and the purpose of his words point in opposite directions. He is using the meaninglessness of existence not to push his sister away into despair, but to pull her back from it, to comfort her, to keep her home, to make her feel less alone. He deploys nihilism as an act of love. The message is nothing matters, and the reason he is delivering the message is that his sister matters to him and he does not want her to run away hurting. And that contradiction, using the claim that nothing matters as a tool to care for someone, is not a flaw in the scene. It is the entire secret of the show, because here is what I have come to think Rick and Morty is really arguing underneath the drinking and the portals and the cosmic horror. It is not arguing that nothing matters. It is arguing that nothing matters inherently, that the universe hands you no built-in purpose, that there is no cosmic plan assigning you meaning, and that this is precisely why the small, warm human connections you choose are the only meaning there is. If nothing matters on its own, then the fact that Morty stays home with his sister, that Rick keeps his grandson close, that Bird Person's daughter pulls him back from death, that a man builds a fake wife just to not be alone in the ruins, these choices are not undermined by the meaninglessness. They are the only response to it that does not end in the garage with a death ray. The show keeps showing you characters staring into an empty, purposeless infinity, and it keeps showing you that the ones who survive it are the ones who reach for another person anyway, on purpose, in a universe where nothing happens on purpose. Which is why I resist the reading of this show as simply nihilistic, even though it hands you nihilism in nearly every episode, and even though its own hero preaches it constantly. Rick is the character who most fully believes that nothing matters, and Rick is also the most miserable, most self-destructive, most broken character in the entire series, a man who tried to kill himself in his garage and built a simulation of his dead wife to talk to. He is not held up as a model of enlightened detachment. He is held up as a warning about where pure meaninglessness actually leads, which is not to peace, but to a death ray and a fake Diane. And every character who is even slightly happier than Rick, Jerry with his ordinary contentment, Bird Person with his restored will to live, Snowball choosing freedom over revenge, Morty choosing his sister over despair, is happier precisely to the degree that they have refused Rick's philosophy and chosen connection instead. The line says nobody exists on purpose. The whole rest of it is a decade-long argument that the only way to survive that truth is to start doing things on purpose anyway, starting with loving the people in the room with you. Come watch TV was never the nihilist part. Come was. There is a specific kind of anxiety this show returns to over and over, and once you notice it, you cannot stop seeing it, which is the fear that you cannot actually tell whether anything around you is real. We have already brushed against it from several directions tonight. The Decoy families who cannot prove they are the originals, the two Beths with no detectable difference between copy and source, the microverse people who do not know their whole universe is a battery, the man who lives a full life inside an arcade game. But the obsession was announced very early, in the 4th episode of the first season, an episode whose title puns on the filmmaker known for twist endings, and it is worth pulling out because it faintly tells you what game the writers intend to play with you for the next decade. In it, Rick and the family go about a fairly ordinary adventure, and it slowly becomes clear that something is off, that the world is glitching at the edges, that people are behaving slightly wrong, and the reveal is that almost none of it is real. Rick has been captured by a species of alien con artists who trap their marks inside elaborate simulations, layered fake realities trying to fool him into revealing his secrets by making him believe he is living a normal day. What makes it delicious is how the episode nests the deception. Rick figures out he is in a simulation, and then it turns out there is a simulation inside the simulation. A fake within the fake designed to catch him the moment he lets his guard down thinking he has escaped, so that even the moment of realizing it is not real is itself not real. The aliens run reality after reality on him, each one a trap, and Rick has to navigate the vertigo of never being sure which layer is the true one. And the audience is put in exactly Rick's position, unable to trust any given scene, taught in the 4th episode of the whole series that the ground under a Rick and Morty story might dissolve at any moment into another layer of fabrication. It is a statement of intent. This show reserves the right to tell you that what you just watched did not happen, that the reality you were emotionally invested in was a construct, and it will use that right again and again across its run. And what strikes me is why I think that anxiety is not just a fun science fiction toy, but something closer to its actual worldview, its deepest fear made into a recurring plot device. If you are a being like Rick who has seen infinite realities, who knows that his own family is a replacement, that his daughter has been doubled, that whole universes sit inside batteries, that con artists can fabricate a convincing world around you at will, then the ordinary human confidence that this, right here, the room you are in, the people you love, is real and solid and reliable, becomes impossible to sustain. Rick cannot fully believe in his own life because he knows too much about how easily a life can be faked, copied, or simulated. His intelligence, the thing that makes him a god in any room, is also the thing that has stripped him of the ability to trust that any room is real. He is too smart to be fooled, and therefore too smart to be comforted, because comfort requires believing that what you have is yours, and Rick has seen behind the curtain too many times to believe that about anything. That, to me, is the hidden cost the show keeps circling without ever quite stating outright. We tend to imagine that being the smartest being in existence would be a kind of paradise, endless capability, endless understanding, every door open. Rick and Morty spends a decade arguing the opposite, that total knowledge is a specific kind of hell, that the more completely you understand how reality works, how universes nest and copies proliferate and simulations layer, and everyone you love could be a decoy or a clone or a fabrication, the less able you become to simply live inside a single reality and love a single set of people, and trust that any of it is real and yours. Morty gets to be comforted by his brother's nihilism because Morty is not smart enough to see all the way down. Rick sees all the way down, and what is down there is a hall of mirrors with no original at the end of it, and a man standing in it who cannot remember or cannot trust which reflection was ever him. The writers made that fear the 4th episode, and they never really stopped being afraid of it. One thread I have not pulled yet is the series' running war with any authority that claims to hand out meaning from above, and Rick's relationship with the idea of God, because it turns out to be one of the most consistent things about him across the whole series. and it produced one of the first season's sharpest episodes. In the 9th episode of that first season, the same one that gave us the butter robot, an antique shop opens in town, run by a suave, well-dressed man, and the shop gives away wonderful items for free, and every item comes with a monkey's paw-style curse, a wish granted that ruins the wisher. The shopkeeper is the devil, more or less, a supernatural figure trading in cursed bargains and human misery, an ancient power that feeds on people's greed and desperation. Summer goes to work for him, charmed, and Rick's response to the literal devil setting up shop in his town is not fear, not awe, not any of the reverence a supernatural being of that scale might expect. Rick is simply offended that this creature exists and thinks it can operate in his town, and he sets about systematically neutralizing every cursed object, following behind the devil, undoing his work, purely out of spite. And it ends with an image that tells you everything about how this show sees cosmic authority. Rick and Summer, having beaten the devil at his own game and driven his business into the ground, do not simply win and walk away. They corner the humiliated devil and physically beat him up, the two of them pummeling an ancient supernatural entity in a training montage set to upbeat music, treating the embodiment of evil not as a figure of dread, but as a punk who needed to be taught a lesson. There is something almost joyful in Rick's contempt there, and it is the same contempt he shows everything that positions itself above ordinary people as a source of judgment or meaning or moral authority. Rick does not believe in the devil as a force to be feared any more than he believes in God as a force to be worshipped. To Rick, a supernatural being that trades in cursed wishes is just a con artist with a longer resume, and the appropriate response to a con artist is to expose him and, if the mood takes you, to give him a black eye. That posture, Rick's flat refusal to bow to anything that claims cosmic authority, is one of the most consistent traits he is given, and it connects directly to the deepest wound we have talked about all night. Remember that Rick's whole tragedy begins with a universe that took his wife and daughter for no reason, a bomb through a portal, a random cruelty from another version of himself. A man who has experienced that, who knows firsthand that the universe contains no justice, no plan, no benevolent hand arranging things for the best, is not going to kneel to any being that shows up claiming to be in charge. Rick's atheism, his contempt for gods and devils alike, is not really an intellectual position he reasoned his way into. It is grief hardened into a stance. If there were a god worth the name, Diane would be alive. She is not alive, in any universe, anywhere. Therefore, as far as Rick is concerned, there is no authority above him worth acknowledging, and any being that claims otherwise is lying or selling something and deserves, at most, a beating. What I find almost quietly moving about this is that Rick and Morty does not entirely let Rick have the last word on it, even here. Because for all his contempt for higher meaning, Rick keeps behaving, in his least guarded moments, as though certain things are sacred to him after all. He will not worship a god, but he will cross the multiverse for decades to avenge a wife. He will mock all meaning as a con, but he will build a simulation of Diane to sit with rather than accept her total absence. He beats up the devil and calls all cosmic authority a scam, and then he goes home and, in ways he would never admit, treats his messy, ordinary replacement family as the one thing worth protecting. Rick is a militant atheist about every meaning imposed from above, and a helpless believer in the small meanings that come from below, from love, from grief, from the people in his kitchen. He tore down every god the universe offered him, and then without fanfare built a private religion out of a dead woman and a scared boy, and never once called it that, because calling it that would mean admitting that something matters, and admitting that something matters is the one bargain this proud, broken man will never sign. There is a question that hangs over the entire series once you have added up everything Rick can actually do, and it is maybe the truly damning question the series asks about its own hero. Look at the scope of his power as we have cataloged it tonight. This is a man who can create entire universes from scratch, populated with real intelligent life, and use them as batteries. He can cure diseases the rest of the galaxy considers incurable. He can traverse realities at will, build a working artificial consciousness in the shape of a dead woman, crash the economy of an interstellar empire in an afternoon, and turn himself into a pickle and back. He commands, functionally, the power of a god. And the question you are never allowed to fully look away from is this. Given all of that, given the capacity to reshape reality itself, what does Rick actually choose to do with it? And the answer, episode after episode, is astonishingly small and astonishingly petty. He gets drunk, he picks fights, he chases a discontinued fast food sauce, he avoids therapy by becoming a vegetable, he nurses grudges, he runs from his feelings across 100 dimensions rather than sit with them for an hour. That gap between what Rick can do and what he chooses to do is, I think, the real tragedy the show is built around, and it is a more interesting tragedy than simple grief. A man with godlike power who is merely sad would be one thing. Rick is a man with godlike power who uses almost none of it to make anything better, including himself. He could, in principle, direct that staggering intelligence at his own pain, at his family's happiness, at reducing the suffering of the countless worlds he moves through. He does not. He aims it at survival, at spectacle, at escape, and at the occasional spiteful score to settle. The universe made Rick nearly omnipotent, and Rick spends that omnipotence mostly on running in place. And the series is clear-eyed enough to know that this is not a flaw the power could fix, because the reason he does not use his genius to heal himself is the same reason he has the genius in the first place. The intelligence and the damage grew together, out of the same wound. And you cannot deploy one against the other without them canceling out, because here's the cruel logic of it. Rick's intelligence is, in large part, what he built to survive losing Diane. It is armor and weapon and distraction all at once, a mind sharpened to a razor precisely so that it would never have to sit still in the room with the grief that made it. Asking Rick to turn that intelligence toward healing his own pain is asking the armor to attack the body it was built to protect. The genius exists to avoid the feeling. It cannot be pointed at the feeling without dismantling its own reason for existing. So Rick uses the most powerful mind in any reality to do everything except the one thing that might actually help. And he cannot do otherwise because the mind was constructed as an elaborate machine for not doing that one thing. He is not choosing pettiness over healing out of laziness. He is choosing it because his whole self is organized around never healing. Because healing would mean feeling the loss, and feeling the loss is the thing the entire apparatus of Rick Sanchez was assembled to prevent. And that, finally, is why I do not think Rick and Morty is really a show about a genius at all, even though it is dressed up as one. It is a show about a bereaved man who happens to be a genius, and whose genius is the most elaborate coping mechanism ever depicted in fiction. A portal gun and a spaceship and a curved slice of infinity all built at bottom, so that one man never has to be alone in a quiet room with the fact that his wife is gone from every reality that ever was or could be. The science is real, the adventures are real, the multiverse is real, and all of it is scaffolding around an absence. When you understand that, the series stops being a comedy about a smart old man and his grandson and becomes something closer to a portrait of grief so total that it had to invent an infinite universe to have somewhere to hide from itself. The smartest man in existence built all of this, and the one thing all of it is for is to not feel one specific thing. That is the hidden fact underneath every other hidden fact we have talked about tonight. It was always, all of it, about her. Let me lighten the register for a stretch because it is not only a grief machine, it is also one of the most self-aware pieces of television ever made about its own existence. And its relationship with the people who watch it is a fascinating hidden story in its own right. Rick and Morty is constantly, knowingly commenting on itself. It makes jokes about its own long gaps between seasons, about its own plot mechanics, about the very idea that a series like this accumulates canon and continuity that obsessive fans will track. There are moments where the writing seems to be arguing with the audience directly, poking at the kind of viewer who demands more lore, more answers, more of exactly the thing a video like this one is built to satisfy. The writers know they have spawned an army of people who treat the show like scripture, who make charts of the dimensions and argue about which Beth is the clone, and they hold a complicated, sometimes prickly attitude toward that army, at once feeding it and mocking it, handing it dense mythology to chew on and then teasing it for chewing. That prickliness got sharper after Rick and Morty became a genuine phenomenon because the fandom, at its edges, developed a reputation the people making it were not entirely comfortable with. The Szechuan sauce affair was part of it, that image of crowds turning ugly over a condiment because a cartoon told them to want it, but it went beyond a single sauce. As the series got bigger, its most intense fans became known, fairly or not, for a kind of entitled aggression, and the creative team was quite open in interviews and in the work itself about finding some of that energy troubling. And you can watch the response fold into the stories, building a wariness about its own audience into episodes that seem designed to frustrate the exact appetites the fandom was loudest about, refusing to deliver clean answers precisely to a crowd that was demanding them. There is something bracingly honest about a hit show willing to look at the least flattering parts of its own success and put that discomfort on screen rather than simply cashing the checks and smiling. And underneath the meta jokes, there is a real philosophy about serialized storytelling the show has more or less stated outright through its structure. Rick and Morty has always resisted becoming purely a plot delivery machine, a series that is only about advancing its mythology from one revelation to the next. For long stretches, especially in the middle seasons, it deliberately pulled back from serialized lore and made standalone episodes, self-contained adventures with no bearing on the larger story, almost as if to prove it did not have to feed the continuity beast every week. The tension between the dense mythology, the Central Finite Curve, and Rick Prime and Evil Morty and all of it, and its stubborn insistence on also just being a weird, funny cartoon that can do a random episode about anything, is a real creative argument playing out across the seasons. The lore is there for those who want it, but you keep getting reminded, sometimes gently and sometimes with open irritation, that the series refuses to be reduced to its lore, that an episode is allowed to be about nothing, to be a joke that goes nowhere, to resist the very completionist instinct that gathers all these hidden facts into a 2-hour video. I mention all of this partly out of honesty because a video like the one you are listening to is exactly the kind of thing the show sometimes gently ribs, the loving obsessive cataloging of every detail, the treatment of a cartoon as a text to be decoded. And I think the healthy way to hold that is with a bit of humor about ourselves. Yes, we have spent a long time tonight tracing dimensions and devices and the exact status of a Birdman's resurrection. And no, Rick and Morty would not entirely approve of treating it all as a sacred puzzle with a single correct solution, because a real part of its message is that the meaning is not hidden in the trivia, it is in the feeling, in Morty comforting his sister, in Rick building a ghost of his wife, in the small human warmth that survives inside the cosmic despair. So take the hidden facts for what they are, a way into a show that rewards attention and not as the point itself. The point was never the map of the multiverse. The point was always the two people driving through it and what they meant to each other, which no chart of dimensions will ever quite capture. So where does all of this actually stand now that the series has run as long as it has? And what are the genuine open threads still hanging in the air, the ones the series has not resolved and could still pay off? The biggest is Evil Morty, because when we last had a clear fix on him, he had done the single most consequential thing anyone in its history has done. He punched a hole through the Central Finite Curve and walked out of it into the true, uncurated, infinite multiverse, the reality no Rick was ever willing to enter. And then, for the most part, he was gone, off the board, somewhere out in an infinity that the series' own portal technology cannot reach. That leaves an enormous question mark over everything. He is out there. He got what he wanted, freedom from a world rigged around Rick's, and there has been no hurry to tell us what a Morty does with the actual infinite once he has it. Whether he comes back, whether the breach he made changes the rules for everyone else, whether the wider multiverse he escaped into has its own dangers waiting, all of that is unresolved. A door deliberately left standing open. Then there is the matter of the weapon, which is the loose thread I find most quietly ominous. When Rick finally killed Rick Prime, ending the revenge quest that had organized his entire life, a detail slipped in that most viewers registered only faintly, and it may turn out to be one of the most important things in the later mythology. Before the confrontation ended, Evil Morty got at the Omega device and kept its design, the schematics of the weapon that erases a person from every reality at once, straight out of Rick Prime's work. Which means the most terrifying device it has ever conceived, the thing that murdered Diane across all of infinity, is not gone for good. The knowledge of how to build it survived, and it survived in the possession of the one character clever and detached enough to actually use it. That is a loaded gun left on the table, an existential weapon whose blueprint now sits in the hands of a free and unaccountable Morty somewhere out past the edge of the known multiverse. Whatever the series does with that, it has softly told us that the power to unmake anyone, everywhere, forever is still in play. And closest to home, there is Rick himself, because the series did something brave and difficult when it finally let him win. For a decade, Rick's revenge was the engine under everything, the secret purpose that gave a nihilist a reason to get up. And then he was allowed to have it, allowed to beat his enemy to death with his own hands, and then the writing had the honesty to show that getting what you have organized your whole life around does not fill the hole, it only reveals how deep the hole always was. A Rick without a revenge quest is a new and unstable thing, a man who finished the one task that kept him moving and now has to figure out whether there is any reason to keep going that is not simply momentum. That is the most interesting place the show could possibly have left its lead, and it is where the later seasons find him, no longer hunting, no longer defined by a mission, just a grandfather and a grandson in a garage with an infinite universe outside and nothing in particular left to prove. What Rick becomes when he has nothing to avenge is a question the series is still, as it continues, in the middle of answering. As for the series as an object in the world, it is not going anywhere for a good while yet. It has been renewed well beyond its current run, with more seasons ordered than have aired, a long runway secured by that enormous commitment the network made years ago and the further commitments that followed. The show that fans once feared might vanish after any given season, that made its audience wait through droughts of a year and a half, is now one of the most stable fixtures on the schedule, contracted deep into the future, and it managed that while surviving the loss of its co-creator and the recasting of both its title voices, an upheaval that would have killed a lesser show, absorbed with barely a visible seam. Whatever you think of where it goes from here, Rick and Morty has proved to be remarkably durable, a strange, crude little cartoon that turned into an institution and shows every sign of outlasting the doubts that surrounded it at nearly every stage of its life. Before we close, I want to give a proper moment to the family member who quietly has the healthiest arc in the entire show, because she is easy to overlook next to the cosmic drama and she deserves better, and that is Summer, Morty's older sister. When the series begins, Summer is written as a fairly standard teenage girl, phone-obsessed, status-conscious, a background presence in a story that is mostly about her grandfather and her brother. Rick barely registers her at first, treats her as unremarkable, the kind of ordinary teenager he has no use for. And then something happens across the seasons that is never made into a big speech but clearly means a great deal. Summer grows into one of the most capable, adaptable, tough characters in the whole ensemble. She goes on adventures and does not just survive them, she thrives, handling the horror and the violence and the absurdity with a resilience that often outstrips Morty's. By the later seasons, Rick actually respects her, sometimes seems to prefer her company, takes her along not out of obligation, but because she is good at this, because she can handle the multiverse without falling apart. What makes Summer's arc land for me is that she absorbs Rick's world without absorbing Rick's damage, and that turns out to be a rare and important thing. Morty, we have seen, hardens under the weight of the adventures, accumulates trauma, needs a room full of memories surgically removed just to keep functioning. Summer takes the same exposure to cosmic horror and comes out the other side stronger and, crucially, still herself, still able to feel things, still connected to her family, not hollowed out the way Rick is, and not quietly breaking the way Morty is. She learns Rick's competence, his refusal to panic, his ability to look at something impossible and simply deal with it, and she somehow does not learn his nihilism, his self-destruction, his inability to love without hiding it. If Jerry is the series' portrait of ordinariness without genius, Summer becomes its portrait of something much rarer, capability without corrosion, a person who can walk through Rick's universe and not be poisoned by it. And I think the writers know exactly what they are doing with her, because they keep faintly positioning Summer as the answer to a question Rick himself could never solve. Rick's whole tragedy is that his intelligence and his damage are welded together, that he cannot be brilliant without being broken, that the mind and the wound grew from the same root. Summer suggests that the welding is not inevitable, that you can acquire the competence, the nerve, the ability to face a meaningless universe without flinching, and still keep the capacity for connection that Rick sacrificed. She is proof, sitting right there in the family, that Rick's way is not the only way to be strong, that you do not have to choose between being capable and being whole. Rick looks at Jerry and sees everything he is glad he is not. He looks at Morty and sees a project, a tool, a reluctant heir. But when he looks at Summer in his better moments, I think he sees something closer to hope. Evidence that a person can take everything he has to teach and come out less broken than the teacher. She got the adventure without the ruin. Of everyone in that house, she is the one who found the thing Rick spent an infinite multiverse failing to find, which is a way to see how empty it all is and choose to keep loving people anyway, without needing to build a single machine to hide from it. There is one last small thing I want to leave you with before we drift toward the end, and it is a phrase, not a plot point, because it has always struck me as its accidental thesis hiding inside a gag. Early in the first season, in that same episode where Rick boosts the dog's intelligence, there is a dream sequence, a bit of nonsense set inside a character's head, and in it a little chant appears, a jingle of sorts. The idea of Rick and Morty going on forever, 100 years, forever and forever. It is played as absurd, a fever dream fragment, a joke, but that phrase, forever, 100 years, has followed the show around ever since, adopted by fans as a kind of unofficial motto, printed on things, chanted at the creators, held up as a wish for the series to never end. And there is something almost unbearably poignant in that, once you hold it next to everything we have talked about tonight, because Rick and Morty is a story fundamentally about the fact that nothing lasts forever, that people die and are erased and replaced, that even an infinite multiverse cannot give you back the one thing you lost. And its fans took its silliest throwaway jingle and turned it into a prayer for permanence, for a thing that goes on and never stops. I think that tension is Rick and Morty in miniature. Here is a series that will tell you, flatly, that everybody is going to die and nothing means anything. And what stands out is an audience that responded by wanting it to last 100 years, forever and forever, that fell so completely in love with a story about impermanence that they could not bear for it to be impermanent. And maybe that is the truly human thing about the whole phenomenon. We know, the way Rick knows, that nothing lasts, and we reach for the things we love anyway, and we ask them to stay forever, 100 years, knowing they cannot, doing it anyway, because the reaching is the point. The show spent a decade arguing that the only meaning available in a meaningless universe is the connection you choose in spite of it. And then its fans proved the argument true by choosing to love a cartoon so fiercely, they turned its dumbest joke into a plea for it to never leave them. Rick could not save Diane, but a chant from a dog's dream became a way for millions of people to say to a thing they loved, "Please stay forever, 100 years." That is not a fact you will find on any wiki. It is just the truest thing I know about why this show matters. And that is where I want to leave the hidden facts, not on a dimensional designation or a device or a death, but on that, the strange, warm permanence a show about impermanence somehow earned. We have covered a great deal tonight, from a crude little internet cartoon made to needle a movie studio, all the way out to the edge of the Central Finite Curve and back to a garage where a grieving man talks to a ghost he built. And if there is one thing I hope stays with you as you drift off, it is that Rick and Morty is not really the cynical show it is often taken for. It wears cynicism like armor, the same way its hero does, and underneath that armor, it is one of the more heartbroken and, in its own buried way, one of the more tender things on television. A story that looked into an empty infinity and decided that the only sane response was to love the people standing next to you in it. It began as a joke, a filthy parody knocked out for a short film festival, and it became a decade-long meditation on grief and connection and what it costs to be the smartest and loneliest man in every universe there is. That it did all of that while also being a very funny cartoon about a drunk scientist and his nervous grandson is, honestly, a kind of miracle. And I do not think we will see many more like it. So, wherever you are, however late it has gotten, I hope some of these hidden corners of the series made the whole thing feel a little richer, a little deeper, a little more worth the rewatch. Thank you for spending these quiet hours here at Paper Town, for letting these stories keep you company as you wind down. Rest well, be gentle with yourself, and remember that even in an infinite and indifferent universe, the small warm things you reach for are the whole point. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.